had been designed by Sikorsky to trip specifications. The purpose of the Miami flight was to test whether the flying boat could stay aloft for the time and distance needed to fly from San Francisco to Hawaii. This was one of several range and fuel consumption test flights done mostly by music as a means to develop Pan Am's two-ocean strategy. They also had to test radio navigation, which was also brand new at the time. The March flight was ultimately successful. It earned Music his first big burst of publicity. Pilots were big news in the 1930s, especially when they made flights that broke a record or achieved something that had never been done before. There was a lot of that going on at the time. Lindbergh was succeeded by a deep bench of air stunt heroes, including Wiley Post, the first person to fly solo around the world, and even movie and aircraft mogul Howard Hughes, also flew around the world solo. With his usual diplomatic and political audacity, Tripp had negotiated with the U.S. Navy for rights to land on two desolate Pacific islands, Wake and Midway Island. In fact, Tripp influenced the transfer of authority over those islands in the Navy by order of President Franklin Roosevelt in 1934. Wake and Midway were tiny, uninhabited bits of sandy coral in the Pacific. Ron Tripp laid risk again, realized that it was crucial for Pan Am to establish a trans-Pacific airline route that would only work if he had the planes that could physically do it. The range and fuel requirements to fly from San Francisco to Hawaii, the longest part of the route, were at the far outside reach of what was technologically possible for aircraft in 1935. But this is where Tripp lived and worked, at the far edge of what was possible. Music's March 1935 flight was followed by several others, including the test of a new Sikorsky S-52 from San Francisco to Hawaii, and then Hawaii back to San Francisco, especially treacherous due to headwinds and increased fuel consumption. But even a flight that barely made it, like when Music's test flight from Hawaii to San Francisco on June 22, 1935 did, was enough for Tripp. While these test flights were being conducted, engineers working for Pan Am were hastily assembling infrastructure on Wake and Midway sent there by ship. On Wake Island, engineers had to use underwater explosives to blast enough coral out of the lagoon to make a landing by a Sikorsky flying boat safe enough to attempt. Environmentally, this was highly questionable, but ultimately it worked. The first Pan Am test landing on Wake Island lagoon was made August 17, 1935 by Ron Sullivan and Music's former co-pilot. By 1935, the regulatory environment had also changed. The federal government's practices of awarding airmail contracts as per that 1925 Act blew up into a major scandal in 1934, and the new administration of Franklin Roosevelt, who reportedly detested Tripp personally, revoked most of the contracts that were awarded. Pan Am was still in the game, though, at least with respect to airmail to the Far East, mainly because they were the only serious option. Those smaller upstart operations were, if they kept on Tripp's heels all the time. Still, he was the only one who had all three of the elements needed to establish a transoceanic airline route. Planes that could get there, the landing rights, and the infrastructure at the destinations to handle it.
Are you an entrepreneur? Are you in a business now that you find yourself wearing all the hats?
World-renowned motivational speaker.
Les Brown
Mr. Les Brown.
is one of the most inspiring motivational teachers in America today.
You have greatness within you.
Life knocks you down. Try and land on your back, because if you can look up, you can get up. It's not over until I win.
Hello, my name is Les Brown. Are you in a business now that you find yourself wearing all the hats, but you want to be competitive? You want to be able to have more time for yourself, for your family, but most of all, doing that which you are.
Planes. The first regularly scheduled Pacific route flight went off, which carried mail, not passengers, went off in late November and early December 1935. Pan Am was now officially flying from San Francisco to Manila, Philippines, via stops in Hawaii, Midway, Wake Island, and Guam. The plane that did it wasn't even a Sikorsky, but rather a Martin 130, a bigger flying boat that was in testing phase, and with Music flights earlier that year. The first flights on this route carrying actual paid passengers passenger commenced about a year later, October 1936. One trip named the planes that made these voyages Clippers, after the famous sailing ships of the 19th century. What's known in Pan Am history as the Clipper era had begun. At this juncture, I have to say something about a prominent cultural depiction of Pan Am's early Pacific service. In one of my favorite moments of one of my all-time favorite movies, Raiders of the Lost Ark, a moving line on a map shows us the progress of swashbuckling archaeologist Indiana Jones as he travels from the U.S. to Nepal. Jones is seen boarding a flying boat in the harbor, and then the line interspersed with special effects footage of an airplane flying across the Pacific. The route traced by the line is mostly accurate, though it seems to skip midway. Pan Am did not fly from Manila to Nepal, though presumably Jones could have gotten some kind of air charter from those hops. Headcanon here. With respect to the Clipper route across the Pacific, it is possible that a paying passenger could have flown this route during the year 1936 when the this place. It was late in the year, after October, when the service was initiated. But apparently it is after October because as Jones boards the plane, one of the Nazi bad guys shadowing him is seen reading a magazine. The particular issue he's reading is the issue dated November 30th, 1996. Surprisingly accurate for an Indiana Jones picture, the only inaccurate thing here, aside from skipping midway, is the aircraft seen in the boarding shot. It is not a Mark 130, but rather a shortened Soviet Mark III. In 1980, when the picture was being filmed, the producers couldn't find a real Mark 130 with the engine. Although the short Solent resembles it, that plane actually did not fly until 1946, a decade after the picture. Of course, this route would have been very spendy in 1936. The one-way fare was about $950, which is the equivalent of over $20,000 in today's rate. Jones, though, is working for Army intelligence in this film, so they might simply have requisitioned the seat for it. Anyway, back to the real history of the Atlantic. As for the other ocean, the Atlantic, one trip turned his attention to conquering it the following year, 1937. He followed the same pattern: diplomatic contract negotiations for landing rights, followed by test flights of various aircraft, and ultimately the institution of regular service. Pan Am had two main routes across the Atlantic. The northern route, which utilized Newfoundland and Ireland, and the southern route, hopping from North America to the Azores to Portugal. Various types of flying boats were used for this service, including the Boeing 314, the largest and most advanced airliner of its time. By the outbreak of World War II in Europe in 1939, Lottrip's immense game of global risk definitely paid off. He owned South America and the Caribbean. He owned the Pacific route. He owned the Atlantic route, which was the jewel route. Many of his audacious gambles weren't profitable in isolation, but air travel was becoming so critical in the late 30s that Pan Am as a whole couldn't help but be afloat. There were incidents and accidents, of course. The most well-publicized one was the loss of the Samoan Clipper Submersible-S-42, which blew up while trying to land in Pago, American Samoa, in January 1958. Edwin Musick, the hero airline pilot, was killed in this disaster. Later that same year, there was also the disappearance of a Clipper on the Pacific route, the Hawaii Clipper, the M130, which vanished between Guam and Manila on July 28, 1948, presumably killing people. One of the grim things about running an airline is that people will be killed using their service sooner or later. Air travel in the 1930s was not nearly as safe as it is now, but on the other hand, these early planes carried only a handful of passengers at a time, so truly mass casualty disasters were still needed. The fact to note about Pan Am in this era that becomes very important later is the kind of corporate culture the airline was developing. Pan Am pilots like Edwin Musick were still regarded early in their careers in much the same way as those stunt flyers of the 1920s and early 30s, like Lindbergh and William Joseph, thrilled the newspapers with their record exploits. These guys, most of whom started flying in the barnstorm or even the World War I era, areas were risk takers. They would push airplanes to their farthest technical limits, into maneuvers, especially tricky takeoffs and landings, that were often risky for at least unorthodox. They had to, by definition. Pan Am was the only airline doing what it was doing in 1939 on the scale they were doing it. Pilots had to land in the lagoons of distant atolls, bays and coves, sometimes where there were rough seas, headwinds, or other unfavorable conditions. And the captains, Juan Trippe insisted on using naval terminology for naval personnel, were the absolute commanders of airplanes. Even co-pilots were regarded as a somewhat lower form of life on the pecking order. As a result of all of this, Pan Am pilots were often difficult to get along with, stubborn, or even arrogant. Their places in the company were governed strictly by seniority, how long they'd been with the outfit. The captains who got to fly the big flashy planes on the important routes across the Atlantic and Pacific were often the ones who'd been with the company the longest. Pan Am hadn't been around very long, but as its existence stretched forward in time, it became clear that it would take junior pilots a long time to work their way up the choice routes of big sexy planes. That was Pan Am's culture. Remember that, it becomes important for later. So, for the latter half of the 1930s, Pan Am was truly in its early golden age. Most of the romantic and nostalgic visions of the airline in the pre-jet age center around this time, what you might call flying boat time. Pan Am was more profitable than ever before, but as we'll see in the next chapter, the world was about to change rapidly.
I'm always looking for inspiration for my next event. That's why I love home goods, and I never know what I'll find. Ooh, look at this throw. Stunning.
On September 1st, 1939, Adolf Hitler flung his Wehrmacht army against Poland, which triggered World War II in Europe. The war was already going on and had been for some time in Asia, particularly in China, where Pan Am had significant operations, though the United States was technically still at peace with Japan. That would change, obviously, but we're not there yet. As Hitler got rolling with his monstrous conquests in Europe, Von Trippe was fighting his own battle to keep Pan Am's monopoly on transatlantic civilian air travel. His first potential competitor was American Export Airlines, owned by a marine shipping company. After fierce political battles in Congress, and with the agency that regulated U.S. air travel, the Civil Aeronautics Board, President Roosevelt, who, as you recall, disliked Von Trippe and vice versa, signed an order in July 1940 that approved American Export service in New York and Lisbon, Portugal. Incidentally, to throw in another movie reference here, if you've ever seen Casablanca, all the refugees in the city of Casablanca in the story are trying to get to Lisbon, and as the narrator says at the beginning of the film, from Lisbon to Rome. The reason Lisbon was the place was because with the outbreak of the European War, the Neutrality Act prevented American flag carriers, meaning Pan Am, there was only one at first, from flying in belligerent countries. Portugal was neutral in World War II, so was Ireland, but for practical reasons, Pan Am closed the Ireland route early in the war, which made Lisbon the only place where anybody could get air transport from Europe to the United States. Pan Am profited handsomely from people trying to flee Europe after the outbreak of war. The Lisbon-New York Clipper route was constantly sold out. In 1939 and 1940, the company posted huge profits. Anyway, Von Trippe relied on some influence in Congress to keep American export from actually flying for several years until after the U.S. had joined World War II. And even then, its operations were small compared to Pan Am's, because most of its transatlantic operations were part of the war effort. Incidentally, Pan Am played a significant role in the war. Many of its airliners were commandeered for military service after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Pan Am's two key stops in the Pacific, Midway and Wake Island, were both battlegrounds with the Japanese early in the Pacific War. Pan Am planes and personnel airlifted troops and materiel from countless theaters of war. I'm not really going to say any more than this about Pan Am's involvement in World War II, because we have to hurry up and get to the post-war period. What a new guy laid out the question of whether Pan Am could or should be the only only American airline to fly overseas, or at least the Atlantic. In other words, whether it would be the U.S.'s flag carrier. Even before the war was over, in September 1943, Tripp wrote up a pamphlet principally aimed at politicians titled A Plan for the Consolidation of All American Flag Overseas and Foreign Airplanes Foreign Operations. This would eventually become a proposed congressional act, which would, as the title suggested, consolidate all overseas airlines into one government-subsidized airline, which would be banned, of course. Now, before you start screeching, OMG, socialism, there are a couple of things that you should know. Even aside from the fact that politically, Juan Tripp was arch conservative. First, Juan Tripp understood from the beginning, old airmail days, that airlines, especially those that flew overseas, simply couldn't function in a free market for-profit model. Economics were just important. Second, the government-supported flag carrier was the model that basically every other country followed. The UK had BOAC, the British Overseas Airways Corporation. Before the war interrupted operations, the French had Air France, and the Germans had Deutsche Lufthansa, the forerunner of today's airline, Lufthansa. Third, and most importantly for our story going forward, as you'll see in future chapters, the U.S. airline that flies overseas is uniquely dependent on the domestic airlines that feed passengers into the system. The U.S. is a much bigger country than the UK, France, or Germany, whose domestic airlines are small. If you live in, say, Chicago and need to get to London, you'll have to get a flight on a domestic airline from Chicago to someplace where you can get a flight that will take you from London to New York City. Pan Am had no domestic routes. You couldn't fly from New York to San Francisco on Pan Am unless you went down to Latin America or went all the way around the other side of the world. So, take a hypothetical example. Made-up domestic airline, Acme Air. You buy a ticket on Acme Air to take you from Chicago to New York. To get the rest of the way to your destination, London, of course, you can buy a ticket on a Pan Am flight from New York to London. But if BOAC, a British airline, flies the same route between London and New York, you might decide to buy a ticket from instead, especially if it was a little bit cheaper. BOAC might be incentivized to cut Acme Air passengers a deal on their tickets from New York to London if, say, Acme Air cut BOAC passengers a deal on tickets for British passengers who wanted to travel on to Chicago after reaching New York. So, you see how this works? The overseas carrier that's most likely to sell the ticket is the one that gets passengers fed into their system from domestic carriers, who in turn feed passengers to them. Juan Tripp argued that this was bad for America as a whole, especially if the flag carriers of other countries, like BOAC, could operate with subsidies from their governments to offer perks, competing American-run overseas carriers couldn't afford if they were in competition with each other and trying to undercut each other on price. BOAC can serve you tea and fresh crumpets on their flights because the government pays for perks. Pan Am wants to compete on perks like that and have to go out of pocket. Furthermore, Pan Am paid its pilots and crew far more than the foreign carriers did because parts of their salaries were government subsidized. Now, I'm not saying I agree or disagree with Juan Tripp's argument. I'm just pointing out that it wasn't totally about his own self-interest in keeping Pan Am monopoly. He did have reasons for wanting to be done this way. Furthermore, there was something a little unfair in how the government agency, CAE, treated Pan Am. They refused to allow Pan Am to open domestic routes, as Juan Tripp proposed in 1945 to streamline the system. So if Pan Am was forbidden from being a domestic carrier, thus relegated by special status to an overseas carrier, shouldn't it be the only overseas carrier, and the domestic airlines forbidden from opening routes overseas? The political and personal conflicts over Tripp's suggested restructuring of the U.S. commercial aviation sphere are the central part of about the second half of Martin Scorsese's 2004 Aviator, which is principally about Howard Hughes, played by Leonardo DiCaprio. I don't have time to go into a lot of detail on this. The movie is partially accurate, but the story it tells is extremely simplified. Tripp, played in the movie by Alec Baldwin, didn't really see Hughes as a personal nemesis, and it was not just the opposition to TWA, which Hughes renamed Trans World Airlines, but all the other major U.S. carriers as well, including United and American. The movie calls the legislative proposal the CAB bill, actually it was called the Community Company Bill. It wasn't one bill, but several, and it played out over a longer time frame than the movie does. Ultimately, the Community Company Bill was defeated in Congress. What is generally accurate about the Aviator is the sequence of hearings in August 1947 into Howard Hughes' alleged war propaganda in his creation of the Hercules Air Transport Plane, better known as the Cirrus Deuce. Senator Ralph Owen Brewster of Maine, played by Alan Alda in the film, was basically in Long Trip's pocket. Hughes pretty much did clown the hearings. Brewster was primary in the next election, 1952, and lost his Senate seat. This sideshow isn't really that relevant to our story, except to explain how and why Pan Am finally began experiencing competition on various routes overseas, not just in the late 1940s was a period of retrenchment in the airline industry. Profits were down, expenses were up. New generations of planes were coming online all the time, such as the DC-4, Lockheed Constellation, as famously the Aviator, and eventually the DC-6, which, with some modifications, became the DC-7, basically the last big airliner developed before the jet age. The 1950s have the reputation of being one of the most iconic eras of air travel. Actually, what I think most people have in mind is the very end of the 1950s, which very much was another golden age. And it was kicked off largely by Pan Am. For most of the decade, though, it was kind of a grinding arms race of planes, routes, corporate mergers, both successful and unsuccessful, and political warfare, like we saw in the company proposal. But jets were always on the horizon since their first experimental application at the end of World War II. Whenever there was a technological advance in aviation, Von Tripp was usually the first to figure out how to turn it into a profit for commercial air travel. That's exactly what he did at the end of the 1950s with the plane perhaps most singularly associated with him, the 707. That's in the next year.
It's the Ashley President's Day sale going on now. Feel the freedom to get your best rest ever with up to $200 off adjustable bases. Plus, you can snooze now, pay later with 0% interest for 60 months. Shop more deals in-store and...
At the very end of World War II, Charles Lindbergh, who had previously worked for Pan Am as a consultant, toured Germany to evaluate aviation developments in the defeated Nazi regime. During this trip, Lindbergh viewed one of Germany's groundbreaking jet fighters, the Messerschmitt Me-262, which made no difference in the war itself, but had a profound effect on aviation after it was over. In the 1950s, Lindbergh was again working for Pan Am after the wartime fallout of his isolationist political activities and his public feud with Franklin Roosevelt. Once all that died down, he did some more recon for Von Tripp, specifically evaluating the Havilland Comet, the first jet airliner that had just been introduced in the UK. The Comet, Lindbergh told Tripp, didn't have the range to fly the Atlantic non-stop, but the plane was a stepping stone to the larger possibility Tripp was already envisioning, which was a fleet of transatlantic jet airliners. Tripp considered buying Comets from Pan Am, and at one point had 3 on order before he came up with a uniquely Von Trippian idea. Why not set the 2 biggest U.S. manufacturers, Boeing and Douglas, against each other in a competition to build jet airplanes for their biggest airline customer? This was the deal of Von Tripp's career. It made Pan Am's second golden age. How he did it is pretty ingenious. It started not with the planes themselves, but with engines, a highly experimental and almost theoretical civilian version of a military engine, J-57, that was then being installed on B-52 bombers. Pratt & Whitney made these engines. The more powerful civilian version, which was called the J-75, was what Tripp wanted on an airliner. It would have the speed, power, and range to enable a plane to cross the Atlantic non-stop. He made a deal with Pratt & Whitney for the J-75 engines, $40 million worth of them. before the planes they would be stuck onto were even finished designing. Then, with his huge order for engines in view, Tripp browbeat the heads of the two aircraft manufacturers, William McPherson Allen of Boeing and Donald Douglas of the Douglas Company, into redesigning the prototype airliners they were then sketching out to use the J-75 engines. Allen tried to hold out, and after fierce negotiations, told Tripp that he was going to have to take the new plane they were designing, the 707, as is, meaning without the 75, J-75s were building. Tripp said, okay, I guess I'll buy 20 more. But at the same time, in fact, on exactly the same day, in October 1955, Tripp signed a contract with Douglas, who had agreed to redesign their new prototype, the DC-8, around the J-75 engines. He would take 25 of those. When Allen of Boeing found this out at a cocktail party of all things, at blonde Princeton at the party, he realized that he didn't want to lose out his biggest competitor, Douglas. He better reconsider. He did. Boeing would, in fact, redesign the 707 to accommodate the engines that Tripp already bought. In the end, Pan Am would get 17 new big 707s, 6 of the mini 707s, and 25 DC-8s, all spanking new, fast, high-capacity jet airliners that could haul passengers across the oceans faster and in greater style than ever before. It wasn't just a coup for blonde Tripp and Pan Am. The deal was a sea change with aircraft manufacturers who now realized that propeller-driven airliners, which they'd sunk a lot of money into developing the later models of, were dead. Pan Am had effectively initiated the jet age. On October 26, 1958, the first regularly scheduled transatlantic flight of a Pan Am 707 departed from New York's Idlewild Airport, later Kennedy Airport, headed to Paris. The flight carried 111 passengers and lasted 8 hours, 41 minutes. This flight changed the world in a lot of ways. Already the previous year, 1957, the number of passengers crossing the Atlantic by air overtook the number crossing by sea. The advent of the Boeing 707 and the DC-8, specifically Pan Am's Boeing 707 and DC-8s, hastened the end of the great ocean liners, chief among them the Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth, which were retired from service in 1968-7 and 68, respectively. The triumph of jet airliners, and specifically the time in which it occurred, may also have affected how people thought about technology and its involvement in their lives. Jet travel that was affordable to middle-class people was a luxury unimaginable for both technological and economic reasons, even 10 years ago. 1958 was the year NASA was the space race was on. It seemed like the world was headed for a future that would be defined principally by technology, and a greater share than ever of ordinary people would reap its benefits. The aesthetic of the space age, embodied among other things by the architecture of the 1964 New York World's Fair, was, I think, heavily influenced by the development of jet airline travel in the late 50s. Pan Am owned that development culturally, at least. Pan Am's second golden age was as much about aesthetics as economics. Don't get me wrong, the airline was raking in money by the plane load in the early 60s. Its stock had never been higher. But these years, particularly the 1960s, embodied what most of us think of when we think of the cultural legacy. Pilots were dashing heroes and sharp uniforms, and it was their job to fly those sleek and beautiful planes that filled the skies with busy international airports. Stewardesses, who weren't yet called flight attendants, were chosen mostly for their looks and their sex appeal, though they were given rigorous training to do their jobs better, more stylishly, than any other service workers in the airline industry, or maybe any industry. These women worked long hours and traveled endless thousands of miles to do their jobs. Most of them were highly enthusiastic about it and loved the company they worked in. Some of them died for it. There were 6 fatal accidents in planes during the decade of the 1960s. There were many more. Mechanics, baggage handlers, ticket agents, maintenance people, all manner of support staff, most of whom never left the ground. They were all part of the Much of what we think of as the Pan Am Golden Age has been immortalized in popular culture. Think of Leonardo DiCaprio, here he is again. Pan Am pilots beautiful, flanked by phalanx of gorgeous stewardesses in the 2002 film Catch Me If You Can. There was a short-lived series on ABC in 2011 called Pan Am, featuring Christina Ricci and Margot Robbie, that dealt in a lot of the same kind of images, and it was set naturally in the mid-60s. Would James Bond fly any other airline other than Pan Am, even as late as 1989, as the Timothy Dalton incarnation of the character does in License to Kill? And naturally, assuming Pan Am survives in the 21st century, in the 60s it was unthinkable that it wouldn't, who would naturally be offering regular service to the moon? Pan Am, of course, which has an immensely valuable product placement in Stanley Kubrick's classic 1968 film, 2001: A Space Odyssey. In fact, largely as a publicity stunt, Pan Am really did promise service to the moon. In 1964, the airline opened a waiting list for people who wanted to purchase tickets for that inevitable day when they would take passengers to lunar orbit. A few years later, the space waiting list was officially named the first moon flight school. Pan Am insisted it was totally legit. At one point, it had over 90,000 names on it. It's hard to imagine any other airline in history getting away with that. Closer to Earth, Pan Am was expanding its terrestrial holdings. I haven't even talked about the line of hotels the airline owned. Intercontinental chain, founded in 1996. The hotels were held by a subsidiary, 100% owned by Pan Am. Most of the hotels started in Latin America and the Caribbean, but they expanded worldwide during, you guessed it, the 60s. And of course, there was the Pan Am Guild. At about the same time, Juan Trippe made his fateful gambit at the 707s into space. He was also gambling on one of the largest office buildings in the world, which at the end of the 50s was planned to go up on the site just behind Grand Central Station on 5th Avenue in Manhattan. When Trippe got involved in the planning of this building, he made typically audacious demands. The airline wanted an equity stake in the property, 15 floors of space and a suite on rent, and perhaps most importantly, the airline's logo and name in letters 30 feet high on all four sides of the building. Trippe didn't quite get all of that. The letters ended up being only 15 feet high, but the Pan Am building, which opened in 1963 and replaced the airline's former headquarters, Chrysler Building, became an icon of the New York City skyline, although not a particularly popular one at first. But if you've seen any movie made in the 60s, 70s, or 80s that features the Manhattan skyline, chances are almost certain that you've seen the gigantic Pan Am. It still exists, of course. You're looking at images of it now, but its later fate is intimately intertwined with the fortunes of the Great Airline and its inevitable decline. So that brings us to the question, perhaps the central question of this entire video. How did that decline begin, and why? How did Pan Am go from the heights it reached in the 1960s to the depths it sank in the 90s? How did the fall of this mighty airport empire begin? The answer is complicated, but it has a lot to do with two planes, one that barely flew at all, the SST, and one that was never expected to fly versus one that did in the 727. I'll explain those in the next chapter. SST is an acronym. It stands for Supersonic Transport. The moment Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in the experimental X-1 rocket in 1947, aviation planners, including Juan Trippe, envisioned large planes, fighters, bombers, or airliners that could travel faster than Mach 1 speed of sound. This was catnip to Juan Trippe, who was always sniffing around the next big frontier in aviation. In the 1950s, various parties on both sides of the Atlantic were trying to develop the SST. The U.S. military was already working on the B-70 supersonic bomber, designed by North American Aircraft. And in 1959, the Eisenhower administration seemed to be getting behind it. But the real progress was being made in Britain and France, whose governments and private aviation interests were joining forces to develop a supersonic plane which would eventually become the Concorde. The problem was that the SST would require vast amounts of research and development costs to work. I mean vast, billions upon billions of dollars, far beyond what could be contributed either by government alone or by private industry alone. And at the end of this tunnel of money, if there was any, there were uncertain returns. SSTs would have advantages in speed, obviously, but they couldn't carry huge numbers of passengers. They would be grotesquely expensive to operate, and they required special infrastructure, not just super long runways at airports, but dedicated flight lanes high above other air traffic. And there were environmental issues, such as sonic booms near airports, most of which would appear in public areas, even chemical damage in the Earth's stratosphere. So, as cool as the SSTs were on paper, it's not clear they would be economically viable as airliners. One Trip, though, didn't care that much. A supersonic airliner could exist, Pan Am had to have one, or several, or perhaps a monopoly on them. At the very least, the Brits and the French were going to have them. America and America's flag carrier had to have them. In 1963, not long after the Pan Am building opened, Tripp himself got into a tiff with some pretty powerful people. The President and Vice President of the United States, John F. Kennedy Johnson, as well as a man called Najib Lockerbie, whom Kennedy had appointed head of the Federal Aviation Administration and the point man on America's SST project. Kennedy was on the verge of making a decision on whether America should go all in on developing an SST. Lockerbie had told Tripp the decision was coming, and he wanted Tripp, who was noted to be considering trying to buy one or more of the British-French SSTs, to hold off on that decision until Kennedy made his. Predictably, Tripp didn't. He announced that he'd signed a deal with the government of France for an option on 6 Concorde planes if when they were developed. JFK was pissed. Why? Because it made it look to the world like he was dithering on the SST, and Pan Am decided to go around it by making a deal with the French. From Juan Tripp's perspective, though, it was just another attempt to play one party off another, the U.S. government versus France, to goad both of them into doing what he ultimately wanted, which was for somebody to commit to building an SST. It was the same kind of decision as the drama that got the Boeing 707 and DC built. JFK did not go all in on the SST. There was too much opposition in Congress, restraining the project as a bottomless money hole, which is probably true. In any event, after JFK's bad day in Dallas and the succession of Lyndon Johnson to the White House, Najib Lockerbie let it be known that he was thinking of quitting the UK. Tripp decided to turn Lockerbie from an enemy into an ally, and so convinced him to join Pan Am as a senior vice president with a seat on the board of directors. Lockerbie came aboard Pan Am at a crucial moment. Tripp, now in his mid-60s, was approaching retirement age, at least the age at which most executives retire. He knew he probably had one last chance to make a big, bold move to stretch commercial aviation into the future. He hoped that move would have been the SST. By 1965, the fate of that project was very much in doubt. Though Tripp still believed it would eventually be built, Pan Am needed a stopgap plane to tide it over until the SSTs were flying a bridge between the 707s, which were still fabulously successful in the 60s, and the futuristic SSTs, whether they ended up being Concordes or something else. Furthermore, this stopgap plane would have to be economical enough to make overseas air travel feasible for everyday people. So we're talking about a gigantic plane with a huge hauler capacity, very fast, with powerful engines, but economical to operate, such that ticket prices were at least within the reach of many Americans wanting to take holidays or even business trips overseas. In August 1965, the same month, American combat troops were flooding into Vietnam, and Jay's decisive escalation, many of them delivered on the planes. One Tripp went on a fishing trip on Puget Sound in Washington State with Bill Allen and Boeing. Tripp and Allen engaged in the same kind of hypothetical shadow boxing they had done 10 years earlier when wrangling about the 707. The way Robert Gant, author of one of the major sources for this video, puts it is absolutely perfect. Imagine Allen saying, Would you buy it if I built it? And Tripp saying, would you build it if I bought it? The it, as hypothetical exchange, is the Boeing 747, largest passenger airliner in the world, which did not exist in 1965, but would revolutionize aviation if it was built, and it would only be built. Pan Am decided to buy it. Letter of intent was signed on December 22nd, 1965. The 747 was a colossal undertaking. Each plane would cost from $17 to $20 million, 2.5 times the cost of the Boeing 707. Allen wanted Tripp to buy 25 of the monsters, plus spare parts. That came to a bill of about $500 million, 2.5% of which Pan Am would pay up front, plus more payments in 6 months. Pan Am would have to cough up $250 million before the first 747 got off the ground. To be sure, the 747 deal was make or break for Boeing 2. The company would have to build a new production plant even before they started making 747s. Pan Am wasn't their only customer either. If no other airline decided to buy the giant plane, Boeing couldn't recoup the outlay it needed to build it, and the company would go bankrupt. The deal, if it went bad, could destroy both Boeing and on April 12, 1966, Juan Tripp went before the Pan Am Board of Directors in a conference room on the 46th floor of the Pan Am building. The board had to formally approve the 747 deal. Tripp, who was very confident, laid out his numbers. He told them air traffic was going to increase by 15% each year until at least 1966. The 747s, each one of which would replace 2.5 707s, would operate at a cost of 30% less, measured per seat per mile flown. It was a bargain, he said. If there was a fulcrum moment in history, then Pan Am's rise suddenly tilted. This moment, the fall of Pan American Airways began that April 12, 1966. It was basically Warner's fault. He couldn't have known it at the time. The numbers he presented to the board were all perfectly supportable at that moment, but they turned out to be pennies. The board approved the deal. Of course, the 747, Tripp's faithful gambler, would be built. This is the Hyatt Grand Central New York Hotel. It's across the street from Grand Central Station and the former Pan Am building, and it used to be known as the Commodore Hotel. On May 7, 1968, room called the Windsor Ballroom, the annual stockholders meeting of Manager was held, with Juan Tripp presiding, as he had at every stockholders meeting for the past 41 years. This year, however, the news was a little different. Pan Am's profits for 1967 almost 21.5% of this year. In the first quarter of 1968, revenues were up 15.6%, but expenses were also up 22.6%. The loss represented 4 cents per share. The previous year, it had been a profit of 15 cents. Pan Am had started with this one. Before this could sink in, Tripp announced quietly retire. Harold Gray, technically the president of Pan Am, would succeed him as CEO. An hour later, meeting Pan Am building, the board voted this change back. Najib Halabi, who had expected to take over Pan Am after Tripp's retirement or death, was voted chairman and president, but Harold Gray was clearly put in charge. It was a fortuitous time to get out. Pan Am's decline had begun in earnest, and it was visible to anyone who looked close. But few did. Tripp's predictions First Lady Pat Nixon christened Pan Am's first operational 747 at Dulles Airport in Washington. By this time, Pan Am, under the rule of Harold Gray, had gone even deeper into the 747 project, luring 8 more for June 33 and signing off to build a new terminal and maintenance facility. York's Kennedy Airport to handle the leases, which together cost another $224 million. As a plane, the 747 was pretty cool. Even aside from its absolutely gargantuan size, it was sleek and streamlined, the endpoint of the aesthetics that aviation designers were heading in the 1950s and 60s. Everyone knows about the top deck of the 747. Connected to the lower deck was a spiral staircase. Early models, the top deck was often a cocktail lounge, piano bar. The idea of drinks and hijinks on the top deck of the 747 crept into popular culture imagery in the 70s, as much a hallmark of the decade as studio decor. You've seen it in countless movies, not least of which were the airport disaster sequels, two of which featured 747s as the main scene. In 2015, I did an article on my old blog, which I recently reran on my new blog, Garden Memory, celebrating the life and times of the 747, which I call The Skies Happen. The link to that article is in the description. In addition to fast, glamorous, high-capacity airliners perfectly designed for hops between continents, the 747 has taken on a lot of other roles that were not envisioned at the time of its original design, such as the carrier plane for the space shuttle, or more recently, high-capacity cargo planes, which high-speed delivery services like FedEx and Amazon could not exist without. None of that was supposed to have happened. No one envisioned in 1966, when they were on the drawing board, that these planes would still be flying nearly 60 years later, though Boeing finally stopped producing them in 2023. Still, Wantrip and Bill Allen intended them from the beginning as a stopgap measure, principally to keep Pan Am on the cutting edge of aviation until SSTs took over. They were never intended to be the final word in airliner evolution, only a stepping stone. So what happened to the SST anyway? Well, not that much. The U.S. Congress killed public funding of the SST project in 1971. That was already largely behind anyway. The British and French did continue their Concorde project, the first of those planes flew commercially in 1976. But the Concorde was never economical for exactly the same reasons that were suggested in the 1950s and 60s. The shape they were required to meet meant they would be cramped and have fairly small passenger capacity. Various major airports banned the Concorde because of the noise pollution issue. They were even banned for a time at New York's Airport, though that was lifted. Essentially relegated to a prestige project, the last Concordes ended service in 2003. Incidentally, research into the environmental effects of supersonic airliners led to the discovery of the degradation of Earth's ozone layer by CFCs, or fluorocarbons, which were banned by international treaty in 1987. That effort itself had significant implications for efforts to combat human-caused global warming, which obviously have not been nearly as successful as the CFC. All the climate change deniers watching just turned off this video in disgust and unsubscribed. Anyway, back to the 747. Though undoubtedly an advance in aviation design and culture, the big planes on which Wantrip made his latest gamble did not arrest aviators in the early 70s. In fact, they made it worse. Instead of 707s crossing the ocean after him, it was now big 747 jumbos, whose seats Pan Am ticket agents were having a hard time finding funds to fill. To its credit, Pan Am operated the 747 quite safely, though because the planes had such giant capacity, incidents involving them were by definition horrendous gas-touching disasters. On March 27, 1977, in Tenerife, Canary Islands, two 747s, one operated by Pan Am, the other KLM, Royal Dutch Airlines, collided on the runway long. A total of 583 people were killed. The worst aircraft-related disaster in history, which ironically happened on the ground. Pilots of the Pan Am 747 who were killed were held not to be responsible as KLM's fault. Pan Am 747 involved in this disaster, incidentally, was the self-same one that had Nixon christened in Washington 7 years ago. On October 24, 1978, a bit more than a month after the signature achievement of his presidency, the Camp David Accords, President Jimmy Carter signed the Airline Deregulation Act into law. This piece of legislation, which had been coming for many years, was the single biggest seismic change in history of the American commercial aviation industry since its beginning. And it proved, at least for Pan Am, to be an unprecedented disaster, at least in terms of its survival as a company, far bigger than any air crash, terrorism, economic downturn. It certainly didn't seem like that at first. In fact, in the abstract, it looked like deregulation would solve many of Pan Am's most attractive problems. Of course, it didn't work out that way. Let's go back to 1970, the year 727 started to come online. Najib Halabi, remember him, had finally taken over as Pan Am's CEO after Harold Gray resigned in late 1969 due to illness. Pan Am had suffered some setbacks in this period, principally as a result of the CAE, Civil Aeronautics Board, increasingly allowing other airlines to fly trans-Pacific routes, routes of which Pan Am had held almost a monopoly since the 1930s. But the CAB, which still had to approve all the airline's requests for routes and fares, was still refusing, as it always had, to give permission to Pan Am to fly a significant number of domestic routes. Furthermore, the CAB and airline policy in general was strongly influenced by members of Congress who gave perks to airlines based in their states and districts. The whole process had become poisoned by politics. Unable to rescue Pan Am economically or politically, Halabi was replaced in 1972 by William T. Sewell, a former bomber pilot in World War II, and also high and sat as a air command. Sewell was kind of like a bull in a china shop. He yelled and screamed in meetings. He downsized the company, shedding nearly 15,000 jobs during the 70s. He closed some of Pan Am's most traditional outposts and canceled long-standing routes. Beginning in 1976, Pan Am did begin to recover. It probably had as much to do with an uptick in international air travel after the Afghan War, the energy crisis in the early 70s, than it did with anything that Sewell had done. But it was still pretty precarious. By 1978, the year of deregulation, Pan Am had only 7.5% of the market share of overseas travel, at 20% from the 50s. When Carter put pen to paper, though, suddenly Sewell saw a way to save the airline. Post-deregulation, the CAA abolished, airlines could fly anywhere they wanted. Pan Am could finally get domestic routes. If you remember the discussion from Chapter 4 about how domestic routes fed overseas carriers, you'll see why this was a big deal. But the problem was, it would take at least 10 years and probably $1 billion to build a domestic airline network from scratch. The airline would have to buy lots of small planes and build out terminals and regional airports. Hub and spoke model to which most domestic airlines started to turn post-deregulation. In 1978, Pan Am had more money than it used to have a few years earlier, but it didn't have 10 years or $1 billion. The only way to do it would be for Pan Am to buy an existing domestic airline and take over its operations. Eastern, the airline started by World War I base Eddie Rickenbacker, now headed by former Apollo moon astronaut Frank Borman, was too big, and the relationship between them and Pan Am was acrimonious. So Sewell set his sights on a smaller target, National Airlines, which was run out of Miami. Founded in the 1930s, National had a few overseas routes, especially to Cuba, at least before Castro took over, and the usual stable of domestic routes, San Francisco, LA, Miami, Houston, etc. National had some DC-10s, 747 or 2, and a big terminal in Miami. It seemed an attractive target for Pan Am. In 1979, William Sewell began buying stock of National. There was a bit of a dramatic showdown between Sewell's Pan Am, Eastern wanted a piece of National, and a corporate raider named Frank Lorenzo, who eventually bought Eastern. But after some mishigas, Pan American Airways formally acquired National Airlines on January 7th, 1980, for the price of $374 million. Many in the press thought Pan Am grossly overpaid, and Pan Am's employees, especially its pilots, weren't happy. In addition to swallowing up most of Pan Am's cash, National acquisition introduced a huge problem to the airline. Question of seniority. This goes back to something that I said in Chapter 3. The pecking order of pilots hard to move up. And some poor schlubs were made co-pilots or flight engineers for decades. And because Pan Am had been shrinking for the last 10 years, they had hired no new pilots since 1968. By contrast, National had been hiring like crazy and people moving up quickly. Now that they were the same company, how to integrate their workforce was a major issue. Imagine, for example, a hypothetical co-pilot, let's call him George, hired in, say, 1965, the golden age. At the time of the National merger in 1980, just about to move up to pilots after 15 years. Now imagine a National Airlines co-pilot, we'll call him Sid, hired in 1977, a few years ago. Under the system in place at National, he too is just about to move to pilots. If Pan Am or National seniority is integrated purely on the basis of being higher, George is obviously going to get the next pilot slot. He's got over 12 years seniority for Sid. What about Sid, who was just about to move up? If you do the integration this way, you send him to the back of the line for promotion, behind literally every Pan Am pilot in the airline, because none at all have been hired for the past 12 years. Is that fair to Sid? On the other hand, if you integrate the workforce on the basis of relative seniority, Sid, who's been flying for only 3 years, might indeed get that next pilot slot, dooming George to remain a co-pilot despite 15 years in that position. Is that fair to George? Being much older than Sid, probably has 2 kids in college by now, and really needs a loan pay. So, you see the problem. The seniority issue in the Pan Am National merger went all the way to arbitration. The decision, which came out in March 1981, was a complicated pseudo-compromise that sought to preserve positions on the basis of expectations. But because people could expect to move up at National much faster than they have at Pan Am, what this meant in effect was freezing most of the Pan Am employees in the jobs they were at the time of the merger. Sid, in effect, would get the next pilot slot, not George. At about this same time, 1981, Lon Tripp, the old founder of American Airways, died. Though long retired from day-to-day operation of the airline, he was still technically a part of it in an emeritus position, and occasionally attended ceremonial functions. That stopped in September 1980 when he suffered a catastrophic stroke. On April 3rd, 1981, a second stroke carried him off. He was 81 years old. Pan Am renamed one of its 747s after him, the Clipper 1T Tripp. By the time of his death, the empire he founded was in severe decline. By the mid-80s, Pan Am was losing $1 million a day. The National deal had been a disaster. Forced to do anything it could for cash, the airline sold the Pan Am building in Manhattan to the MetLife insurance company, though the building retained its brand name. Sewell also sold off the hotel chain Intercontinental to the British conglomerate. In August 1981, while this deal was still in the works, William Sewell took early retirement. The board hired a new CEO, Edward Acker, who had formerly run Braniff Airlines in Florida. He was the first CEO of Pan Am who had never been a pilot. After tinkering with routes and new business strategies, the equivalent of rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, Acker started asking Pan Am's employees to fund the airline's losses by negotiating huge salary cuts. 5 major unions represented employees: pilots, flight attendants, flight engineers, air transport workers, and teamsters. They did in exchange for union representation on Pan Am's board, but it merely sowed the seeds of conflict. Pan Am didn't make money. In 1984, the airline lost over $200 million. The company stopped contributing to employees' pension funds, and then a few months later extended unilaterally the pay freezes the employees agreed to, and which were supposed to have been temporary. On March 1st, 1985, 4 of Pan Am's 5 labor unions went on strike, the first major strike in the company's history. When Pan Am hired scabs to keep operations running, the unions eventually became. Decades-long friendships within the company had been destroyed, as well as the trust between management and employees. It was another signpost pointing toward the eventual end of the merger. Now even more desperate, shortly after the strike ended on April 22nd, 1985, Ed Acker agreed to sell Pan Am's legacy Pacific routes and 18 planes to United Airlines for $750 million. It was one of the few big assets the airline had left, but it was also the core of their business. Those were the routes Wantrip had developed with the flying boats back in the 1930s. This was the route Indiana Jones flew in 1936 in his fiction. One representative of the pilots' union said to quote, "It's not our what's next?" By the late 1980s, perfectly designed for hops between cockpits, the 747 has taken on a lot of other roles that were not envisioned at the time of its original design, such as a carrier plane for the space shuttle, or more recently, high-capacity cargo planes and high-speed delivery services like FedEx and Amazon could not exist. None of that was supposed to have happened. No one envisioned in 1966, when they were on the drawing board, that these planes would still be flying nearly 60 years later, though Boeing finally stopped producing them in 2023. Still, Wantrip and Bill Allen intended them from the beginning as a stopgap measure, principally to keep Pan Am on the cutting edge of aviation until SSTs took over. They were never intended to be the final word in airline evolution, only the steppers. So what happened in the SST? Well, not that much. The U.S. Congress killed public funding of the SST one after it was already largely dead anyway. The British and French did continue the Concorde project in the first commercially in 1960. The Concorde was never economic for exactly the same reasons that were suggested in the 1950s and 60s. The shape they were required to be meant they would be cranked and have fairly small passenger capacity. Various major airports banned the Concorde because of the noise pollution issue. They were even banned for a time at New York's JFK Airport, though that was lifted. Essentially relegated to a prestige project, the last Concordes ended service in 2000. Incidentally, research into the environmental effects of supersonic airliners led to the discovery of the degradation of Earth's ozone layer by CFCs fluorocarbons, banned by the International Treaty in 1987. That effort itself had significant implications for efforts to combat human-caused global warming, which obviously have not been nearly as successful as the CFC. All the climate change deniers who were watching just turned off this video and disgusted unsubscribed. Anyway, back to the 747. Though undoubtedly an advance in aviation design and culture, the big planes on which Wantrip made his biggest gamble did not arrest Panam's decline throughout the 70s. In fact, they made it worse. Instead of 707s crossing the ocean half empty, it was now the big 747 jumbos, whose seats Pan Am ticket agents were having a hard time finding funds to fill. To its credit, Pan Am operated the 747 quite safely, though because the planes had such giant capacity, incidents involving them were by definition horrendous mass casualty disasters. On March 27, 1977, in Tenerife, Canary Islands, two 747s, one operated by Pan Am and the other KLM, Royal Dutch Airlines, collided on the runway. A total of 583 people were killed, the worst aircraft-related disaster in history, which ironically happened on the ground. Pilots of the Pan Am 747 were killed or held not to be responsible as KLM's fault. The Pan Am 747 involved in this disaster, incidentally, was the self-same one Pat Nixon christened in Washington 7 years ago. On October 24th, 1978, a bit more than a month after the signature achievement of his presidency, the Camp David Accords, President Jimmy Carter signed the Airline Deregulation Act into law. This piece of legislation, which had been coming for many years, was the single biggest seismic change in the history of the American industry since its beginning. And it proved, at least for Pan Am, to be an unprecedented disaster, at least in terms of its survival as a company, far bigger than any air crash, terrorist incident, or economic downturn. It certainly didn't seem like that at first. In fact, in the abstract, it looked like deregulation would solve many of Pan Am's most intractable problems. And of course, it didn't work out that way. Let's go back to 1970, the year 747 started to come online. Najib Halabi, remember him, had finally taken over as Pan Am's CEO after Harold Gray resigned in late 1969 due to illness. Pan Am had suffered some setbacks in this period, principally as a result of the CAB, the Civil Aeronautics Board, increasingly allowing other airlines to fly trans-Pacific routes, routes over which Pan Am had held almost a monopoly since the 1930s. But the CAB, which still had to approve all the airline's requests for routes and even fares, was still refusing, as it always had, to give permission to Pan Am to fly a significant number of domestic routes. Furthermore, the CAB and airline policy in general was strongly influenced by members of Congress who gave perks to airlines based in their states and districts. The whole process had become poisoned by politics. Unable to rescue Pan Am economically or politically, the lobby was replaced in 1972 by William T. Sewell, former bomber pilot of World War II, and also high and SAT, Strategic Air Command. Sewell was kind of like a bull in a china shop. He yelled and screamed at meetings. He downsized the company, shedding nearly 15,000 jobs during the 70s. He closed some of Pan Am's most traditional outposts and canceled long-standing routes. Beginning in 1976, Pan Am did begin to recover. It probably had as much to do with an uptick in international air travel after the Yom Kippur War, the energy crisis in the early 70s, than it did with anything that Sewell had done. But it was still pretty precarious. By 1978, the year of deregulation, Pan Am had only 7.5% of the market share of overseas travel, at 20% in the 50s. When Carter put pen to paper, though, suddenly Sewell saw a way to save the airline. Post-deregulation, the CAB abolished, airlines could fly anywhere they wanted. Pan Am could finally get domestic routes. If you remember the discussion from Chapter 4 about how domestic routes fed overseas carriers, you'll see why this was a big deal. But the problem was, it would take at least 10 years and probably $1 billion to build a domestic airline network from scratch. The airline would have to buy lots of small planes and build out terminals and regional airports, hub and spoke model to which most domestic airlines started to turn post-deregulation. In 1978, Pan Am had more money than it used to have a few years earlier, but it didn't have 10 years or $1 billion. The only way to do it would be for Pan Am to buy an existing domestic airline and take over its operations. Eastern, the airline started by World War I ace Eddie Rickenbacker, now headed by former Apollo moon astronaut Foreman, was too big, and the relationship between them and Pan Am was acrimonious. So Sewell set his sights on a smaller target, National Airlines, which was run out of Miami. Founded in the 1930s, National had a few overseas routes, especially to Cuba, at least before Castro took over, and the usual stable of domestic routes, San Francisco, LA, Atlanta, Houston, etc. National had some DC-10s, 747 or two, and a big terminal in Miami. It seemed an attractive target for Pan Am. In 1979, William Sewell began buying stock of National. There was a bit of a dramatic showdown between Sewell's and Pan Am. Eastern wanted a piece of National, and a corporate raider named Frank Lorenzo, who eventually bought Eastern. But after some mishigas, Pan American Airways formally acquired National Airlines on January 7th, 1980, for the price of $374 million. Many in the press thought Pan Am grossly overpaid, and Pan Am's employees, especially its pilots, weren't happy. In addition to swallowing up most of Pan Am's cash, National acquisition introduced a huge new problem to the airline: question of seniority. This goes back to something that I said in Chapter 3. The pecking order of pilots, which was extremely important in Pan Am's corporate culture, was based entirely on how long someone had been with the company. It was really hard to move up at Pan Am. Some poor schlubs remained co-pilots and flight engineers for decades. And because Pan Am had been shrinking for the last 10 years, they had hired no new pilots since 1968. By contrast, National had been hiring like crazy and people were moving up quickly. Now that they were the same company, how to integrate their workforce was a major issue. Imagine, for example, a hypothetical Pan Am co-pilot, let's call him George, hired in, say, 1965, the golden age. At the time of the National merger in 1980, just about to move up to the pilot seat after 15 years. Now imagine a National Airlines co-pilot, we'll call him Sid, hired in 1977, only a few years ago. Under the system in place at National, he too is just about to move into the pilot seat. If Pan Am and National seniority was integrated purely on the basis of being hired, George is obviously going to get the next pilot slot. He's got over 12 years seniority over Sid. What about Sid, who was just about to move up? If you do the integration this way, you send him to the back of the line for promotion, behind literally every Pan Am pilot in the whole airline, because none at all have been hired for the past 12 years. Is that fair to Sid? On the other hand, if you integrate the workforce on the basis of relative seniority, Sid, who's been flying for only 3 years, might indeed get that next pilot slot, dooming George to remain a co-pilot despite 15 years in that position. Is that fair to George, who, being much older than Sid, probably has 2 kids in college by now and really needs a bump in pay? So, you see the problem. The seniority issue in the Pan Am National merger went all the way to arbitration. The decision, which came out in March 1981, was a complicated pseudo-compromise that sought to preserve positions on the basis of expectations. But because people could expect to move up at National much faster than they have at Pan Am, what this meant in effect was freezing most of the Pan Am employees in the jobs they were at the time of the merger. Sid, in effect, would get the next pilot slot, not George. At about this same time, 1981, on Tripp, the old founder of American Airways, died. Though long retired from day-to-day operation of the airline, he was still technically a part of it in an emeritus position and occasionally attended ceremonial functions. That stopped in September 1980 when he suffered a catastrophic stroke. On April 3rd, 1981, a second stroke carried him home. He was 81 years old. Pan Am renamed one of its 747s after him, the Clipper 1T Tripp. By the time of his death, the empire he founded was in severe decline. By the mid-80s, Pan Am was losing $1 million a day. The national deal had been a disaster. Forced to do anything it could for cash, the airline sold the Pan Am building in Manhattan to the MetLife Insurance Company, although the building retained its branding. Sewell also sold off a hotel chain, the Intercontinental, to a British conglomerate. In August 1981, while this deal was still in the works, William Sewell took early retirement. The board hired a new CEO, Edward Acker, who had formerly run Braniff Airlines in Florida. He was the first CEO of Pan Am who had never been a pilot. After tinkering with routes and new business strategies, the equivalent of rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, Acker started asking Pan Am's employees to fund the airline's losses by negotiating huge salary cuts. 5 major unions represented employees: pilots, flight attendants, flight engineers, air transport workers, and teamsters. They did it in exchange for union representation on Pan Am's board, but it merely sowed the seeds of conflict. Pan Am didn't really want it. In 1984, the airline lost over $200 million. The company stopped contributing to employees' pension funds, and then a few months later extended unilaterally the pay freezes that the employees agreed to, and which were supposed to have been temporary. On March 1st, 1985, 4 of Pan Am's 5 labor unions went on strike, the first major strike in the company's history. When Pan Am hired scabs to keep operations running, the unions eventually became. Decades-long friendships within the company had been destroyed, as well as the trust between management and employees. It was another signpost pointing toward the eventual end of the road. Now even more desperate, shortly after the strike ended on April 22nd, 1985, Ed Acker agreed to sell Pan Am's legacy Pacific routes and 18 planes to United Airlines for $750 million. It was one of the few big assets the airline had left, but it was also the core of their business. Those were the routes Long Trip had developed for flying boats back in the 1930s. This was the route Indiana Jones flew in 1936 in his fiction. One representative of the pilots' union said of this deal, quote, "It's cutting off our money farm. What's next?" By the late 1980s, basically all Pan Am had left were the main Atlantic routes, a few domestic routes that got from National as the packages with the Shuttle, and some of those Latin American Caribbean routes that had been established back in the 1930s with long-trip risk. The Pacific deal got some cash back into the coffers, and Pan Am was even able to recall some of its furloughed pilots, but nobody had any illusions. The only way the airline could truly be saved was for some deep-pocket corporate raider to come in and throw the lifeboat. Ed Acker finally left Pan Am in 1958 after a series of boardroom battles with Martin Shrew, a former pilot who ascended to the title of executive vice president, specifically about one of his deals and proposed rescue when the owners of Granite Airlines didn't get the materialized. The new CEO was Thomas Blass, destined to be the airline's last except for voting chairman and it's perhaps a controversial judgment that deregulation ended up exacerbating its decline, when by all rights it should prevent it. It did allow the airline to get the one thing it needed to survive. There was a system of domestic routes. But deregulation ushered in a new and much more dangerous era of economics in the airline industry. There were lots of new entrants into the field, but most of them didn't last very long. And even the majors couldn't make money consistently. Since 1978, every legacy airline bankruptcy at least once, some of them multiple times. Deregulation has come with a great deal of unintended consequences. Pan Am could never compete in this environment. It was never built to. Long-Trip realized back in the 1920s that an airline oriented primarily toward overseas travel simply couldn't make money from work. Perhaps others could, and couldn't. The intricate web of subsidies and regulations and that troublesome CME held back Pan Am for decades, but it had also created an environment in which Pan Am could really survive. Concerned. This wasn't yet clear in the 1980s, but it would become clear later. A decade after deregulation, another disaster, this one entirely unforeseen, greatly hastened Pan Am's flight. It arrived hidden in tape later, packed into a suitcase, loaded onto a Pan Am 747 in Frankfurt, West Germany. The story of that tragedy and its outcome is in this chapter. The story of Pan Am Flight 103 is so complicated and convoluted that it's difficult to tell it in any sort of straightforward manner. So many of the basic facts are disputed or have alternative explanations or speculations that it's almost impossible to craft a narrative of it that somebody somewhere isn't going to appreciate. I'm going to try to avoid all of that as much as possible. The purpose of this analysis is to focus on what this tragedy meant to Pan Am, not to offer a elusive deconstruction of the whole event itself. In other words, don't fill up the comments section with your Pan Am 103 conspiracy theories. That's not what this is about. 4 days before Christmas, December 21st, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103, the 747, on the Bermuda Seas, took off from London's Heathrow Airport for JFK, New York, and eventually Detroit. There were 243 passengers and 16 crew members on board. Although this leg of the flight involving the 747 departed from London, the official Flight 103 actually reached earlier that day in Frankfurt, West Germany, with the 727, Flight 103A. It was on that flight, a short 727 hop from Frankfurt to London, where a Samsonite suitcase belonging to someone booked on the flight was loaded into the baggage compartment. That suitcase was transferred exactly as it should have been to the 747 on which Flight 103 was scheduled to continue, but its owner didn't come on. The suitcase contained baby clothes and a small Toshiba cassette player, which blasted explosives and packed. About an hour after the plane left Heathrow, while it was flying over Scotland just after 7 p.m., the suitcase will explode. The nose of the 747 was sheared off in the first few seconds. The disintegrating plane crashed into the small town of Lockerbie, Scotland, killing 11 people on the ground. The final death toll was 207. It's not entirely clear who the Samsonite suitcase belonged to, or who loaded it on the first night of Flight 104 in Frankfurt. Years later, after many investigations and a trial in 2000, Abdul Qasim al-Badraki was convicted in Scotland of planting a bomb and blowing up the plane, and other victims have stated he was ordered to do so by Libyan dictator Muammar al-Gaddafi. There are questions about whether al-Badraki was indeed responsible, and if he was, Gaddafi ordered the attack. Gaddafi, the dictator who seemed to be quite insane at least at the end of his life, had long been a thorn in the side of Western powers, particularly the United States, who carried out a series of bombing raids on his capitals in 1986 after a series of terrorist bombings in Western Europe were linked to it. The Pan Am 103 attack might have been revenge for these terror raids. 15 years later, in 2003, Gaddafi did formally accept responsibility for the bombing, but he may have done so for political reasons rather than because it was true. The mission was linked to the sanction. But in any event, al-Badraki, released from prison after coming down with cancer, died in 2012. 2020, U.S. authorities indicted another Libyan national for the crime. That case hasn't been resolved, now more than 35 years after the event. In contrast to all the unresolved questions about who did it and why, the fact that the Lockerbie disaster had a huge effect on Pan Am's fortunes is beyond dispute. Tragedy obviously hit the Pan Am company very hard. 16 employees were dead, including pilot James McClark, who had been flying the airline since 1964. The horrifying news pictures from Scotland, which were broadcast endlessly in the days, weeks, and months after the disaster, focused on the nose section of the 747, flying in field and Lockerbie, Pan Am logos and colors, prominent and unmistakable. Somehow, the fact that it happened right before Christmas made it seem even more. The result, whether it was just or not, whether rational or not, was unmistakable. No one wanted to fly on Pan Am and wait for the disaster. Air travel traditionally fell off after the Christmas season, making the first few months of the new year lean ones for an airline given the Christmas bookings. For Pan Am, the Lockerbie disaster made the early months of 1989 It was said in one of the sources I consulted, Pan Am 747s were so heavy the passenger compartments looked like abandoned air hoses. You could spray glitter into the air when ticket counters. No one could walk on the spot. Pan Am had to sell off some of its planes to the company Airbus in the 20s, and it hadn't even taken possession of them in order to fund its payroll for the first quarter of 1989. The slump lasted for a year. Tom Plaskin, the new CEO, was still looking for a white knight who could buy up the troubled airline and maybe, just maybe, turn it around if whoever saved it was willing to pump enough money. By summer 1989, James Bond bought his ticket back to England for Pan Am flight with prices to kill, then business flight. Really the only thing the airline had left were its transatlantic routes, including operations to Heathrow, some Latin American routes as well, and a couple of Europe. But in the era of deregulation, those couldn't be funded on their own. Even to some degree, Pan Am's regulation during history of flashy Atlantic routes were lost later. The Pacific had been the last real money-making asset. Acker had already sold that to United. You had to have a domestic network behind it to feed the overseas routes. Acker screwed that up with the national deal, which never yielded a robust investing system. And to survive, there were some routes in the U.S. Northeast to shuttle, but that didn't generate the cash that was really needed to keep the airline going. The next 1990, slowly, transatlantic passengers started buying tickets again. People were looking for summer vacations to Europe and other places. The specter of the Lockerbie disaster remained, but proving that truly bad luck runs virtually everywhere in the streets, the Imperial Airline suffered another disaster, quite beyond its control. On August 2nd, 1990, Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein. I did one of my most popular videos on the conflict soon after the event. I didn't mention Pan Am in it, but it's inexplicably linked to the Imperial Airline. Exactly the same thing happened in summer 1990 as had at Christmas Eve. Everybody's thinking, no tickets, no sales. 747s across the oceans empty. Here, Pan Am was by now run by the unions. A few months earlier, it had sold some routes that would go around Germany, turned German service to Hansa for $150 million. That money, like everything else the airline had done to raise cash in the deregulation era, vanished briefly. Its expenses were just too great, swallowing everything it could raise. Then, in December 1990, about the same time Saddam Hussein was releasing Western hostages he had held since the invasion of Kuwait, and his sides prepared for what looked like a pretty inevitable military conflict, the company that made Airbuses, the European consortium, canceled Pan Am's leases on 21 Airbus planes. The airline was more than a year behind on payments for those leases. This was the last straw. Pan Am was out of money. It was simply going to have to go out of business. Only a full acceleration was some sort of recovery. On January 8, 1991, 1 week and 1 day before the Persian Gulf War began, such a deal was tentative. Here's how it was supposed to go. Pan Am would file Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The administration would push the first, didn't really want to see Pan Am go down, and give permission for Pan Am to transfer its operations into airlines. And a bank, bankers trusted New York, would advance $150 billion to Pan Am, a third of which would be guaranteed by United. In other words, United would pump some cash into Pan Am's coffers to keep it going in exchange for the London operations. Pan Am could survive another day and try to find a buyer and save it. There was no time to lose. Pan Am told its lawyers and patent firm, Lockerbie, Gottlieb, prepare a bankruptcy plan. We're now moving into the final part of the summer. We mark Ron Tripp's deal with the 747s, the slump in the 1960s and 70s as the beginning and the end of Pan Am. Chaos in the 80s, the strike, Lockerbie and the Gulf War, that's the middle of the end. Now into the end of the beginning, which I want to spend some significant time on because it's an extremely complex story. Bankruptcy, at least for a corporation, at least in Chapter 11 bankruptcy, there are several different kinds, isn't like it is in the game of novel. You're not just out of money and lose the game. It's a legal process, a kind of legally organized gaming frenzy. Creditors are organized and told by a court how many chunks of flesh they can eat from the victim's corpse and in what order. When Pan Am entered bankruptcy in January 1991, no one was sure how or if it would ever get out of it, meaning once the feeding frenzy was over, if there would still be enough flesh left on the bones of Pan Am to enable it to stagger back to its feet and carry on somehow. Most companies, when they enter this sort of bankruptcy, have some kind of game plan. Pan Am didn't. It was literally existing day to day. During the winter of 1991, as the Persian Gulf War was fought and wound down, Pan Am searched for that elusive white knight who might rescue. Surprisingly, they found one. Delta Airlines, which had started as like a regional airline in the South, but had in more recent decades expanded to national and eventually international service. They were interested. Owning and operating Pan Am would raise Delta's stature considerably, but it was going to take a whole lot of money. In March 1991, Pan Am's CEO, Thomas Plaskett, had a bunch of meetings with the CEO of Delta, Ron Allen. Plaskett wanted Delta to buy everything, a quote-unquote total solution, in his words, to the airline's existential troubles. Delta wouldn't do it. They were afraid of what's called successor liability. They would be on the hook for paying some or all many, many debts and have racked up during its many years of unprofitability, some of which might not even have been discovered. If you ever want to scare the bejesus out of a lawyer or a corporate CEO, just run up to them and whisper the words, successor liabilities, in their ear. They'll turn white and start sweating. It's instant. Trust them. It works every time. The deal that ultimately took shape during the summer months of 1991 looked like this. Delta would take control of some domestic routes in the Northeast called the shutdown, remnants of what Pan Am had bought from National Airlines. And Delta would also get the North Atlantic routes. For these elements, Delta would cough up $80 million, which would keep Pan Am alive for 50 months. Then they would refashion Pan Am into a new, smaller airline based out of Miami, serving Latin and South America. Remember, they still had those routes. This was called corporate legal documents, Pan Am 2, or sometimes restructured. Delta Airlines would own 45% of the stock of Pan Am 2, and the other 55% would be owed by the various interests to whom Pan Am owed money. That included the employees and their pension funds. The deal before the bankruptcy court, these interests were represented by the creditors committee, which had on it representatives of the 5 major labor unions that Pan Am traditionally dealt with. The creditors committee was initially unhappy with the deal, and throughout the summer, they exerted pressure to get it changed to terms more favorable to them. They especially wanted to make sure that Delta hired as many Pan Am employees as possible. This wasn't just a corporate adventure happening on some white conference room somewhere, funded by theoretical money and Wall Street speculation. Real people's jobs and savings, their kids' college funds were at stake. Things that pilots, flight attendants, baggage handlers, accountants, maintenance people, and countless others had worked all of their adult lives to build up. The wrangling went on during the summer months. While this was happening, the top movie at the U.S. box office was Terminator 2: Judgment Day. Hated serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer was finally apprehended in Milwaukee, and hardliners in the Soviet Union were quietly plotting a coup against their leader, on August 12, 1991, the main parties, Delta, Pan Am, and Bankruptcy, presented a deal to the bankruptcy judge Blackshear and his corporate bankruptcy. I spoke to an eyewitness who was present at that meeting. The place was packed with rafters with spectators, lawyers, and reporters. Bankruptcy hearings don't usually attract crowds like that, but this one. Blackshear approved the deal. Nearly everyone breathed a sigh of relief. 2 days later, a full-page ad appeared in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal. An open letter signed by Laskin, Pan Am CEO. The exact promise, quote, an airline that will generate $1 billion in annual revenues, employ 6,900 people, operate 50 aircraft, and have the financial strength to handle growth through the purchase of new aircraft. End quote. It sounded great, but in the harsh light of reality, particularly with the economy slipping into recession, the deal began to disintegrate pretty quickly. Laskin, who wrote the letter, didn't have much more to play. 6 weeks later, he was out as CEO, forced out largely by pressure from the creditors. He was replaced by a man named Russell Ray. The main problem was that by the fall of 1991, Pan Am was now a wounded animal that required millions of dollars every day just to keep it alive until the major surgery, the creation of Pan Am 2, could have a chance to heal it. Delta had signed a paper committing it to feed about $140 million into the pipeline, but Delta and Pan Am disagreed on exactly what that commitment meant, when feeding time was, and how much at what time, and how fast. On October 22nd, 1991, Delta and Pan Am signed an agreement clarifying what the funding commitment really meant. Animal got another plate. But the creditors committee was unhappy again, and they had a reason to be. As part of the reorganization, the unions would collectively have to absorb a bunch of concessions, totaling $43 million. It was the only way to keep the airline afloat, management told them, until Pan Am 2 could launch. They, the creditors committee, tried to get Delta and Pan Am to change the deal by threatening to leak information to the press about how things went sideways. Delta executives said that doing this would depress public and travel agent confidence in Pan Am 2 and would cause an effect similar to a run on the bank. In early November, somebody, in fact a member of the Teamsters, indeed leaked a highly downbeat letter to the press. It was printed and quoted in the Miami Herald and the Wall Street Journal. I couldn't tell from the historical evidence whether this was truly what sabotaged the deal, but it certainly had an effect. Holidays were coming up, and travel agents were not recommending that their clients fly Pan Am to Latin America. Pan Am went bankrupt during the holidays, they would be stranded down there. So, want to do Christmas in Trinidad? Try American Airlines. In November 1991, Pan Am's finance was forced to report that the revenues for the month would be nearly $20 million short of what they originally promised. Additionally, the projected bookings of Pan Am 2, the new Latin American airline, were revised downward by almost 30 million. Part of the problem may have been in other parts of the deal, closing the shuttle and transferring the North Atlantic routes, cut off the flow of travelers to Latin American routes. Remember, overseas routes can only work as long as other routes are feeding into them. Very few people were booking what would eventually become Pan Am 2. They were almost out of time. As the Thanksgiving holiday of 1991 approached, Delta's executives were now in a position either pumping more money, tens of millions more, into Pan Am to keep it alive, or whether they should cut their losses. The money was potentially available. Delta had $300 million ready in a bank account a second ago, but it would only work if that Latin American junk, Pan Am 2, or restructured, could get butts in seats and get some money flowing back into the system. During the weekend following Thanksgiving in 1991, the Soviet Union, a month away from its final disintegration, was itself running out of money. President George Bush I, trying to put on a happy face in light of the recession, ultimately punched his ticket out of the White House, went shopping, and bought $28 worth of socks. Ralph Bellamy, actor famous for playing Franklin Roosevelt on stage and screen, died. New York City was sunny and unusually warm 16 degrees. The Addams Family, Martin Scorsese's Cape Fear, that weekend, there were various marathon meetings in corporate boardrooms and law offices all over Manhattan. One of them occurred here at the offices of a law firm called Stroop & Levon, which only recently folded. Others happened, as you might imagine, high above Fifth Avenue, a skyscraper, long trip and custom ordered back in 1961. It was, for Pan Am, the final script. These meetings were contentious. Russell Ray couldn't promise Delta anything. Pan Am 2, if it started, would be feeble at first. The airline wasn't even listed in the yellow pages of the city of Miami. When grilled about how he planned to tackle revenue problems in the future, Ray admitted he didn't know. Furthermore, the status of Pan Am's negotiation with its employees unions was uncertain. The letter that leaked to the press in November had spoiled it. Pan Am was pushing for Delta to finalize the deal on some remotely acceptable terms. But the time clock was coming up as the month turned to December that weekend. Sunday. The fatal decision, Delta's decision to stop funding Pan Am, seems to have been made late on Sunday evening, December 1st. Russell Ray recalled that Ron Allen, the Delta CEO, offered to meet with him at the Pan Am building, but they chose instead to meet at local law firms. At the meeting, Allen said, quote, "Look, we're here on a sad note. We're not going to continue to support your effort, and so we're not, in effect, approving your bankruptcy plan. Your plan is survival." End quote. Under the bankruptcy rules, Pan Am was 10 days away from presenting the court its final plan. It took 10 more days to keep the animal alive. Delta won. Once it was clear that the Delta deal was dead, on Monday, December 2nd, Russell Ray, Pan Am's final CEO, who had only been on the job 8 weeks, remember, turned his attention toward trying to manage the now inevitable shutdown of Pan Am, at least chaotic process. The most important thing was to get the planes and their crews back on American soil. The order to ground the fleet went out on the 4th of December 4th. The eyewitness to these events who I spoke to was present in the Pan Am building when it became known that the deal wasn't complete. Even he couldn't recall exactly how the news came. He said to me, only, "We heard they were unwilling to proceed," as the ring of an epitaph. The people who were there in the Pan Am building waiting for word, the executives, the secretaries, the flight attendants, the pilots, the archivists, the people who swept the floor in the Pan Am building, their jobs were suddenly gone, their pensions cut back, their futures uncertain. The man I interviewed said it was the saddest thing he was ever. He remembered what Pan Am had been like. This was in a recession, one of the deepest that had occurred in the post-World War II era up until that time. It was 3 recap of what that was going to look like. So now we return to where we started at the beginning of December 4th, 1991. Deserted ticket counters, planes being idle on runways, the stranded passengers in airports, and that last ever flight coming back to the Orleans. More than just a company with something, a whole era of aviation history. Once upon a time, you could truthfully say that the sun never set on it, and operations all over the world, and every minute of every day, a Pan Am plane somewhere was flying in daylight. Now, that was all that was left were empty planes, battered baggage carts, an office building, and memories of planes. 1991 was a bad year for airlines in America. Pan Am died at the end of the year. The same year had also seen the end of its one-time ride with Eastern and also Midway Airlines. It was 13 years since deregulation, but the first major round of corporate turmoil in the airline industry was pretty much ended with bankruptcy. When Pan American Airways ceased to exist, about 7,500 people lost their jobs. Many of them lived in the New York area where the airline's headquarters had been for almost all of its existence. In the last few months, in anticipation of the Delta deal and the Pan Am 2 restructuring, many of those employees had moved or were planning to move to the Miami area where Pan Am 2 would be headquartered. Many people had to change their plans as a result. Some were reportedly on the road driving to Miami when the shutdown occurred. Some Pan Am employees had successfully escaped to Delta before they plugged. Pan Am pilots of Airbus aircraft, for example, had already gone to Delta back as the deal was falling apart. Some pilots tried rather desperately to re-qualify on Airbus equipment, so they rehired by Delta. Though it had effectively killed Pan Am by not consummating the deal that saved it, Delta Airlines eventually wound up with a significant number of Pan Am's assets, including Worldport at JFK International Airport, which sported Delta's name and colors for the next 20 years. Delta continued operating flights out of the Worldport until 2013. The building was torn down amidst an outcry of historic preservation. As we saw in the first chapter, the spot where Worldport once stood is now an empty tarmac, on which Delta sometimes parks planes. TWA also got some Pan Am assets, such as a couple of Florida commuter routes that had been known as Pan Am Express. At that time, TWA was owned by famous corporate raider Carl Icahn, who had made unsuccessful attempts to bid on various of Pan Am's assets during the bankruptcy process. Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, MetLife, had technically owned Pan Am from Fifth since 1981, when the financially strapped airline sold for cash. Even by the time of bankruptcy, Pan Am's presence in its old headquarters was minimal. By the end, with it looking like operations were shipped to Miami were down to the floors. The main legacy of the iconic airline was its name, which remained on top of the building for 1 year. The Pan Am building was, in fact, the last large skyscraper built in New York before new zoning laws prohibited corporate logos of that type from appearing on the exteriors of buildings. In January 1993, the big logo finally came down and was replaced with MetLife's, truly the changing of the guard. Since that time, it's been known as the MetLife. There are few traces left of its glory days as the headquarters of America's most important airline. Many caught in the aftermath of the bankruptcy decided not to take the line down. On December 9th, 1991, only a few days after operations ceased, Pan Am creditors committee sued Delta Airlines, contending that Delta had breached various agreements expressly implied by refusing to kick in that final round of funding. Many of the lawyers who had worked on the proposed deal were either involved directly or found themselves giving testimony in this case. The civil case went to trial in the Southern District of New York, courtroom of Judge Robert Patterson in May 1994. The final opinion in this case was issued 2 days before Christmas. The court held in favor of Delta, ruling that the airline had not been in breach of agreements to save Pan Am. Indeed, that Pan Am and its weakened condition hadn't fulfilled conditions precedent to trigger Delta's affirmative obligations deal. The bankruptcy court decision was a major source that I used in making this video. The fallout from the Delta deal was not the only court case involving Penn as I continue to have his death. In July 1992, the Brooklyn jury found Penn liable for $300 million in damages as a result of negligent security procedures in the bombing of Flight 103. Flight 103 families got in line with the rest of Panam's creditors. Wreckage of Flight 103 was considered evidence of all reportedly still stored his wrecking powder shell. In addition to various investigations, civil cases containing the Flight 103 apparently still going on today. The later life of Howard Hughes aviation trip back to the 40s is well known. His various mental issues were portrayed in the front sources of 2004. Out he was particularly obsessed by a station zebra. The unrecognizable shell of his former self, Hughes died of kidney failure or a ear Lockerbie by tragedy, though not caused by terrorism, when Flight 800, almost on its 747, flew out over the United Despite the
Why we shut down folks. We wanted to raise the bar and build the best Batmobile there was. At Amica Insurance, we know this isn't a car. It's more than that. It's the ride your best friend can hear coming from miles away.
Sustain presents Multi-Symptom Dry Eye Relief, starring Stacy, the Skinny One. Sustain Complete Her Solution. Its unique formula gives 8 hours of multi-symptom relief. Open your eyes to lasting relief.
The origin of Batman is so primal and emotion-filled. When Bruce Wayne was a young boy, he saw his parents murdered before his eyes. And at that moment, in the belief that one person can make a difference, he made a vow to get the bad guy who did this and to get all the bad guys, even if he had to spend the rest of his life working in hell, to honor that commitment.
As a man, the flesh and blood of being born and destroyed as a symbol. Something like being corruptible. It's the last. One of the attractions of Batman as a superhero is that gun. You are just an ordinary man and a king. I never said thank you. And you'll never have to. He dedicated his life to fighting crime so no one else in Gotham City would have to suffer the way that he did. He is an ordinary person doing extraordinary things to stop injustice. The Batmobile is the way he gets there. I've got to give you one of those.
The very first Batman story was in Detective Comics number 27 in 1939, and right from the get-go, Batman needed to get from place to place in this city, so he wrote Bruce Wayne's Red Stamp. And in 1941, Bill Finger, the writer, decided to take what Bob Kane had been drawing and dub it the Batmobile, and then working with Jerry Robinson, craft it as something that began to look a little darker, a little bit more serious, and a little bit more bat-like. Movie serial starring Ken Bill Cars. The 1943 Batman movie serial was a 1939 Cadillac, which was the same car Bruce Wayne was driving, but it seemed like if the top was up, it was the Batmobile. If the top was down, it was Bruce Wayne's car.
Come along, fella. You're going with us to the Bat's cave.
It didn't have that symbology, they didn't have any budget to build the bins for it. It was very simple.
When you're hiring new artists for DC to work on Batman, one of the first things they want to do is they want to invent Batman.
What was happening around 1950 was an editorial decision to modernize Batman.
The existing Batmobile has a crash. Batman breaks his leg, and as he's recuperating, he's sitting there drawing up plans for a brand new Batmobile. The Batmobile elongated, the bat face on it grew in size and was far more prominent. And the various artists through the years of the 1950s continued to modify that.
It had different kinds of weapons, different kinds of devices, from story to story, depending on what the writer needed to get him out of some kind of a fix.
I actually have seen a Batmobile in real life. I'm actually seeing a 60s Adam West Batmobile. Still one of my favorites, just because it's the first one.
first iteration of Batmobile I ever saw was the TV show. I remember as a kid there was a massively hardball, multi-field Batmobile. The TV Batmobile was created by George Barris, whose daytime job was customizing cars. The producer, William Dozier, called me from 20th Century Fox. So we're doing a Batman TV show. And we like to create a Batmobile. Now you got 15 days and $15,000. That's the way of it. 15 days. But the challenge is what's it present. Let's go for it. And of course, the big part is that Ford Motor Company has the basic car that we use. I bought the concept car, Futura, from Ford Motor Company for $1. They gave me pieces already that I made fit, but this car has to be a star. What I had to create was a fantasy, and basically, we started wrong. We had it in a no gray primer with a fading white stripe, and we come out of the Batcave. This is done. It ain't gonna work. So immediately I run it back to the shop and painted it in gloss black, and then I went and got sign painting glow paint and went with red and orange because I wanted to bring out the lines. Boom! I take that to the Batcave, and out it comes the Dozier. That's more like it.
Mazda CX-5. It's made to real.
Take advantage of this exceptional offer and bring down Mazda.
Known for pursuing your passions. No one wants to be known for cancer, but a treatment can be. Keytruda is known to treat cancer. FDA approved for 17 types of cancer, including certain early stage and advanced cancers. One of those cancers is early stage non-small cell lung cancer. Keytruda may be used with certain chemotherapies before surgery when you have early stage lung cancer, which can be removed by surgery, and then continued alone after surgery to help prevent your lung cancer from coming back.
Keytruda can cause your immune system to attack healthy parts of your body during or after treatment. This may be severe and lead to death. See your doctor right away if you have cough, shortness of breath, chest pain, diarrhea, severe stomach pain, severe nausea or vomiting, headache, light sensitivity, eye problems, irregular heartbeat, extreme tiredness, constipation, dizziness or fainting, changes in appetite, thirst, anger, confusion, memory problems, persistent or severe muscle pain or weakness, muscle cramps, fever, rash, itching or flushing. There may be other side effects. Tell your doctor about all medical conditions, including immune system problems, such as Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, or lupus. If you had or plan to have an organ, tissue, or stem cell transplant, receive chest radiation, or have a persistent condition, such as myasthenia gravis or Guillain-Barré syndrome.
Keytruda is an immunotherapy and is also being studied in hundreds of clinical trials, exploring ways to treat even more types of cancer. It's true. Keytruda from Merck. See all the types of cancer Keytruda is known for at Keytruda.com and ask your doctor if Keytruda could be right for you.
When I first saw the Batmobile, I was kind of in awe because it had so many wonderful gadgets and things that it did. I feel that we had the first airplane that was sledge and could reach me.
This is supposed to be a jet-powered car. The actual tube is a 5-gallon paint can.
First episode, it was a big deal.
The Batman show rates bigger than anything anybody ever expected.
I drove the Batmobile most of the time, and that's why working on it as Robin was way up. Because I did things with the Batmobile maybe that shouldn't have been done. I would come toward camera and swing the thing around in a big splash of gravel, trying not to hit anyone, because the kids loved it.
Come on, President, to the Batcave. We haven't one moment to lose.
Batmobile represents freedom. That's, as a kid, you want to be able to lose yourself in a fantasy, being that character, hitting the front of the car.
I was probably 4 or 5 when we got a diecast in the toilet that had the jet burn on the back, so the orange flames.
I've got a couple of them. I've got the Matchbox. It's
is anyone will admit about nuts. Trick or tricky. It was so funny. Yeah, it lasted about 3 houses, and
Well, we enjoyed driving it many times for fun. Bat chutes, these are real parachutes, the ones used for race cars. I'm coming down the 101 freeway, and I pop my bat chutes. Going the other way was a highway patrolman.
The Batmobile itself that was in the TV show actually works its way into the comic books themselves because the books want to be reflective of the success the show is getting.
Super Friends TV show started in the 1970s. They also based their animated Batmobile definitely continued to remodel. Throughout the 1970s, there had to have been about a dozen variations. And that continued through the 1980s. There was no set template for a Batmobile.
You turn to 1986. Frank Miller deconstructs Batman in graphic novel.
He rethought what Batman was. It's a darker time. It's a very dystopian world. He needs something big and heavy, and that was this Batman assault tank. It was like, wow. It was the first time you've really seen anything quite like that.
I think when I think of the Batmobile, I always think of the classic Michael Keaton, the first first movie, really low to the ground.
When Ben Oliver and I acquired the rights to Batman in 1979, it took 10 years before the first dark, serious Batman movie came out in 1989. Thanks largely to the genius of two people, Tim Burton and my dear friend Anton First.
up until that time, comic book movies were, I think, seen were light. The only one that I can recall which was a big movie was Superman, but Superman's much more positive, acceptable character for a big movie rather than some dark, internalized guy who dresses up like that. So, I mean, it felt like it was the territory for that kind of movie at the time.
Get an audience to suspend its disbelief and buy into the fact that there could be a guy seriously getting dressed as a bat. That took a lot in order to accomplish that. Part of that is the effectiveness of the Batmobile.
I wasn't interested in making the TV show. I was much more interested in making a darker version of the world where some comic book was. Just going back to the psychology of what the guy is trying to do. He's trying to scare people. He's trying to make a mythic, almost supernatural persona because he is a real person. He's trying to intimidate and frighten. So therefore, the intention with the Batmobile was to look as imposing as possible.
The Batmobile became a very interesting problem because we expected me to go into what a really particular period of time. We just went into pure specialism in the car, taking elements of the salt flat races in the 30s, the speed rays in the 50s.
He's also taking reference from it's big red goes on the Bluebird, the big jet engine goes on its sides as jets.
Reveal visibly improved luminous skin in 14 days. New Olay Super Serum Body Wash.
Finance, that feeling you get when you're all budget and on cloud nine. Let financial come from everyday state of mind. Time to start your journey towards your financial reality. These are 8 words of wisdom with Edward Jones.
I don't know why to see that we got that right, we got the basis of it right, that we did it full size. One of the funny things was Tim came in and said it's really great. The only problem is, he said, how did they get in? There wasn't a door. I forgot. I never thought about it. So they joined us and I thought, well, why don't we get the whole canopy reformed like a jet? At the same time the body was being made, the actual engineering side of it was made.
We got 2 of them. One was the Chevy Impala. The other one was the ugliest pink Oldsmobile colorless convertible you've ever seen in your life.
They have what they call a box chassis. So
Tim Burton said, what are we going to do about headlights? My wife had a Honda Civic, and the lights were that way, and I thought if you turn them upside down, what would you get? They burnt. I turned up behind a Ferrari in a traffic jam, and I thought, oh look, there's a big red round light. So I went to Ferrari, and it was Renegade. I was in a traffic jam again. Right beside me was a Roadmaster bus with a big small killer cap, and that's what you see on the cover.
We had a guy that his rig was aviation scrap. The intake fan was of the emergency generator that dropped down out of the wing of a Vulcan bomber. The tailpipe was different. The tail end of the jet was off a Bristol Viper jet.
The design that we finally ended up with, which I love, was just sort of unexpected, and it made us kind of laugh because it was tough, it was kind of perverse, it had a weird quality to it that I can't quite put my finger on, but it still had that kind of motif to it, and something else, just an aggressive thing, and also just the right sort of paint job and texture, the metal quality to it, give it that sort of scary kind of aggressive persona. Actually go much faster than the amount of room we had, because by the time you got up to speed, you're off the studio line.
As he tried to do the film, at one point as well, I was Batman, where he was cut the door off. That was me and one of the other guys, Barry Winrod, doing all the hits and working the guns. We actually had three of us that did that. When we shut the lid first time out, and he got in with the costume and the door shut, his little ears was sticking out and trapped in the door.
Bob Ridwood, who was the costume designer, made what they call the Batmobile hood, where his ears are just 3/8 short.
I did drive it for a second. I don't think they wanted me to drive it. I took it for like a 50 yards or something, but I was used to like a Ford Fiesta, so, different in terms of feel. Get the car.
It was a paint flip and when you sprayed, one way it was purple, the other way black and a bit of blue, and that's how we got that colour. The trouble is it was very sensitive if you sprayed. If you see the film, you'll see as you're taking the shoes off.
Let's go.
Why she made them off? Because every time she used to get out of the car, she used to scream.
And the details of the car are unbelievable. What you want to do is get things far in terms of the intimidation that comes out of your image.
What I really like about that Batmobile was the torpedo sense of it. It's just this relentless attacking machine and cleverness of what we did for it. It's handling serious turns by picking up cables and making them spin around. This is a Batman that has to be taken immensely seriously because of the weaponry that was presented for the Batman.
It's everything that a young boy loves to drive. A little bit later on, after our 89 Batman movie, Batman the Animated Series began, and they introduced their own version of the Batmobile, which for purposes of animation couldn't be so detailed and complex.
Everything about Batman the Animated Series was a reflection of 40 years worth of Batman to kind of look at. We were able to take those 40 years and sort of distill it all down into one thing. And I think the Batmobile reflects that. It was sort of lightning in a bottle.
For a long time, that too became a lot of people's true image of what Batmobile would be.
My favorite Batmobile would have to be the Val Kilmer one.
I thought the first Batmobile was very beautiful.
And so I thought our job was to sort of refine it and make it our Batmobile.
The Batmobile Schumacher designed for Batman Forever reflected a certainly more colorful Batman, and it all was an integrated look and feel. It was a radical rethinking of what Tim Burton had done.
To tell you the truth, it actually started as 5 separate designs that we built 5 models of. And they all represented sort of different aspects of the design. Joel decided, this isn't the direction I want to go, I want to do something more animalistic.
My first thought was Giger because of the sensuality and anatomy of every machine that he designs. So I got to talk to Mr. Giger and I asked him to design the Batmobile, which he did.
The city has become dangerous. We need Spider-Man. Come on, Spidey. I'm just getting started.
What'd you say your name was again?
Your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Now streaming on Disney Plus.
Unleash the power of the new Kinder Joy DC Funko Pop Toy Collection.
It was an incredible design. Almost a tarantula with not as many legs, just 4 legs. Or 4 wheels, I should say. And I really didn't know how we could incorporate that into the movie or how it would quite function.
Probably just CGI, and we wanted to get a real visual sense that you're not just doing everything in CGI. We wanted this to drive the streets, feel that you can come around the corner. Out of the design process, what became interesting was the idea that there's something underneath this car. It's like a breathing machine. We wanted this to feel sexy and neat at the same time.
I didn't look at the cars for those as far as design goes. But I know it's in a lot of microbiology as well. Jellyfish and creatures that live in the ocean, some of the species, just their forms are actually perfect.
If you look at a bat's intrastructure, the wings, you can see kind of their little bodies through their bat wing. So the wing kind of started playing with ideas of wrapped enclosures where you had an engine that you then took wrappings around so that you could see the engine, but you couldn't really see the engine. So it is a Geek-Grass feeling.
When you're so sketching something car and something else, and what's happening, how would you come back? I would do it until you do a front view, side view, rear view, to execute it in the skill model. Because nothing like this had been sculpted before or built before. We had to sculpt it in layers. You know, we do the underlayer and then pull that up, and then next we sculpt the rib cage and we had to tool that, so it all had to be done separately.
We also had to figure out how to pull molds off the clay without the clay being destroyed.
And then trust that it's going to go together.
Carbon fiber is used mainly on race cars and jet fighters.
The strength of the carbon fiber units for parts, and it reduces weight by ton. Built to the start vehicle, the hero.
He cables a canopy, he has room for his ears.
Its spin would split when it went to supersonic. So the idea of that is to keep the single fin, and then as he's hitting top speed, you see this explode.
The distinct features is the mats and automobiles devised in a sit gear that goes about 6,000 RPM in there to keep that simple vertical. It was a really cool environment inside the shop with a bunch of guys that like don't stuff, right? So you can
driving it in the shop. That's what you need, those kind of guys. All the same passion I have. Just take anything, take it, just a vision that you have and actually go and build it.
Two stock, you know, put two inside of two. Well, like to it, build this vehicle. It's a cool thing. That's hot air, a little water, and a flame.
In order to get that, the flame to extend, use propane with nitrous oxide.
The first time that got tested was in the shop, on the bench top, and it just popped up in a 30-degree angle. And then that didn't help us set up the whole sprinkler system. Building because the flame shot out so far. We dialed that back.
Half the body's behind the rear axle, so when you turn the corner, you gotta think twice because as the front's going to the right, the rear's going to the left.
Joel's the one who was today that that car out of the machine because I was the first one to test her. I took it out and stick it out of the shop and tested the braking system. So you get it to spin around. If you look at the pedals, there's three pedals. There's the gas, front brakes, the brakes. I could go down the street at about 40 and hit the brakes. It almost got all the way around.
And it didn't make it, it just hit the chain link.
That wing was so long. It just
hellacious noise because it was all composite. So we were up and down the street, you could hear that thing.
I just wanted the whole wing up and took off 2 feet of it. I was not everyone's favorite person in the shop. It was a scramble to fix.
I remember when any of my friends brought their children or my godchildren to the set, and I would let them sit in the net. They just freaked out. The net, the big boys, liked it too. I mean, everybody wanted to sit in there and have their picture taken. It was fun. Insurance. We know this isn't a car. It's more than that. It's the ride your best friend can hear coming from miles away.
My fire review was brutal.
We're gonna be underwater for weeks.
I'm already so prudy.
This is fixable. Just use Grammarly. Grammarly can look through the proposal to find what's missing. And look, Grammarly knows the audience is non-technical, so it can take out the jargon and make the benefits easier to understand.
Cool. And with Grammarly working across 500,000 apps and websites, we'll never be underwater again.
Download Grammarly for free.
That was up to me. Signifies sexy. Get behind the wheel, Batmobile here. You're ready to fight some crime. I think the Batmobile is important because it's a symbol.
Worst car ever.
I want a car. Chicks take the car.
And Batman and Robin, I said, I'd love to make this twice as big.
It was a totally new design. This was going to be very long, inspired by the 30s, where the car just seems to come at you forever and ever.
I've never made a longer effect in my life to this day.
And then in the script, it was written that it was a single-seater open this time for the first time. A quarter-scale model is done so you can work relatively fast and quick over to get the shape all worked out. That data is taken by a computer, so that surface will translate into a 3D form. It was really the early 3D days of working like that. Originally, it had no fins. We presented it to Joel. He just thought it needed 2 giant bat-inspired wings in the back. And it gets milled in full flight. The chassis and everything was all done parallel.
And then we did vehicle testing by the airport, make sure that the chassis ran fine, do burnouts, everything you had to do. That was fun. It worked. Burners map, that was a kind of extensive development because we were trying to get the smaller burners out the tail. There was no pre-existing flame source. We tried everything, the hacking on leaf burners, everything else. We actually had to end up building those from scratch. So we had a propane flame and the injection pump with metal and solution metal salts so we could change the color of the flame.
And it was so expensive, I think that's why they did just one
They took the gamble of doing everything with one car, which is it's a risk. So I didn't have to do any crazy stunts. All that was done in miniatures or in CG. When the thing jumps around or drove along that arm, that's a CG model, not a real model.
The car has so many batteries with all the neon that we run on it. Up in here, the side panels, LEDs.
We found this guy who had developed this luminescent paper.
We've got these backlit panels, which are now standard in all cars almost, of this cobalt blue lighting. You could see the rocket inside of its mouth, so to speak. And you also want it to look a little like it's the Bat logo, but it could also be fans. The wing had enough length to it. You could actually see that as almost like it was a flying bat at the moment, where it had this incredible silhouette.
No conventional production tires would fit that car. The tires we used were basically a prototype that the manufacturer creates oversized for this car company's future development. And since they come without tread, it's not really opportunity to cut tread.
So I thought, let's try another Bat logo.
It was cool. As the car would roll, they would leave a trail of bats behind it. You always tell what the car was. You follow the bats.
We look at the interpretation of Batman in film and TV over the years to see how different they are. Same thing in animation and same thing in comics.
I worked on Batman the Animated Series, but it was a revamp of Batman that I had a little bit more input on. The biggest thing was trying to make the Batmobile animatable, but sleek, dark, and fit into the style that we were going for Batman. And then the Batman Beyond Batmobile, we're just trying to make it just really weird. We were trying to make sort of a flying car. Because it was the future, we didn't have to worry about it having wheels. It didn't have to function like a real car. It's kind of a cross between a jet and a race car.
In the storyline of Batman Hush, you get a glimpse of a hall in the Batcave that we had never seen before, which has all the old Batmobiles.
And you looked at all the different interpretations of the Batmobiles and really did capture particular eras of time, and therefore validated almost every story that was ever told for Batman.
In Batman the Cult, there was a monster truck version of the Batmobile that's kind of utterly bizarre. So there have been great variations on a theme over the years. If Batman's going to be effective as a crime fighter in a city, he must have a vehicle that will be an effective weapon.
One of Batman's main tools is his car. And I think that really fits into our American romance with the car. And the idea that, wow, if I had a Batmobile, I could do anything.
For super-quickly pharmaceuticals and sneezes, Trust Plus Plus Lotion is called the flu season, America's #1 lotion tissue.
60,000 bonus points to stop scrolling and start living. Redeem points for travel with Chase Sapphire Reserve.
Nice car.
I should see another one.
I would say I would just watch my back if I saw that car. The tumbler, it's just, it represents, I guess, vengeance, justice. You know, like if that's coming, you're doing something wrong, it's over for you.
I like how the tumbler would actually, when it's on top of the buildings, would have that boost and jump.
You've got fans who are kids now becoming the artists. And what they're doing is they're reinterpreting the Batmobile in a way that they want to see it.
If you took on board the idea that you were going to have to design this icon that you grew up with, I think you'd be paralyzed at a creative sense. We actually very much stressed it from a story point of view. Like, okay, we have to have this vehicle. It has to be able to do certain things in the story, and we have to have a credible design to it, an explanation visually where it's come from. It's done with.
Well, you would be interested in that.
I have this idea of really having something that had the profile that was combined with the way you feel like a hump.
It's not built with the trappings of quote-unquote previous Batmobiles. It doesn't have the bat symbols, it doesn't take on any fins.
Our approach was to try and build something that could really work. We really was to address from the point of view, yes, if you have limitless financial resources and therefore a lot of power in particular ways, material ways, how could you focus that, apply that to creating some very extraordinary gadgets, all of which still are based on real science and real world logic.
So what do you think? Does it come in black?
I went down to the toy shop and bought a Humvee and I bought a Lamborghini boy that's got a saw and cut them up and stuck it together. And then I thought, well, that's a bit boring. So I got a P38 cockpit and glued it all together. That's a bit of a mess.
I did some really awful little plasticine models, just to show me kind of the size I was talking about.
So I showed up with my big glued together plastic thing and he had his little clay thing and they both were pretty bad, but it was a start.
So we bought a lot of model kits, some putting together in different configurations, taking panels off stealth aircraft to get those angles and things.
After 5 or 6 weeks, we ended up with the model this big, to scale, no drawings, nothing.
It's not normal to start with such a prototype from the guy directing the film.
I've never been presented a project that way before. It would normally be concepts, drawings. No, that's totally unique.
And in this team, the first thing they noticed was there's no front axle.
How's the steering going to work? Where's the steering brake going to go? How's it going to handle? And he asked me, can you make that? The answer was yeah. And then your mind starts racing. You go, I just said yes. And now I've got to back that up. Red tires on the car are 44-inch monster truck tire.
Super Swampers, something they call very, very aggressive off-road tyres. And the front ones are oval dirt track racing tyres.
I always use a Chevy V8. It's an automatic, 3-speed.
It was just a roll cage, just to basically get everything running and just get used to it.
What do you think then?
I think I said, better stop before I start.
We went away after and said, you know what, we can run with this. Let's make a 100-mile-an-hour beast that can jump through the air, land, carry on drive. We kept jumping, landing, see where it broke, sweeping it up, jump it again, find the next little bit where it broke.
When you jump in the car, you would think you want to land it on the back wheels. You don't. That's catastrophic. It slaps the front of the car. Actually, you want to bring it in just on the front wheels. Stuff that ended in a shower of springs and shock absorbers and parts rolling down the road that should really not be rolling down the road, yeah.
We were trying to test it to destruction almost, so that when we actually came out the other end of it, we could get on the set, we were confident, that we could do anything that Chris wanted. We tried everything we could to make it as indestructible as we could.
Pretty remarkable thing to see something that you had just put together in this extremely crude, freeform way, rendered in such an exact set of details, and made into something that somebody could really drive.
We built a special car just to get you in and out.
There was a certain Batmobile that I would pull up, and I would drive that one forward, park it.
The nose comes forward and the seat comes up.
He wanted to open like petals on a flower opening up.
It all looked cool, exactly the shit that was all that did. The actual performance vehicle was real stripped down and really bloody noisy inside. It's like having on the Osborne screaming in your ear. I did drive the Tumbler on airstrips, which was a hell of a lot of fun, because I think you go to really pretty good speeds, but you can hardly see anything. So thank God there are some guys doing that, because I would have been very dangerous had I been actually the person in there.
I drive really, really close to the steering wheel. I always have done it, I just feel more comfortable because of the small window that I had to look out of. those lipstick candles that we placed on the outside of the car with two monitors. If I couldn't see what was directly in front of me, I looked to the monitors to make sure everything was clear. Smashed it through everything I could think of. We drove it over the top of cars, through walls, downstairs, upstairs.
He had it supercharged for Dark Knight after Batman Begins, so he could keep up with it.
That didn't need a stunt car to fill in for it. It was actually doing all its own stunts.
We use explosion-proof tanks. If they get punctured, they don't explode. That's stuff that comes from like the race cars. We will always have racing seats and harnesses. The relationship between us building the car and the driver driving it is a trust. You worry about what they're doing. We constantly worry. George communicates very well. If he's concerned about something, he'll say, and then we'll fix it if it needs it, or put his mind at rest. I worry about it, and he's like, son, don't send him off.
With new diamond beam texture, Charmin Ultra Strong cleans better, so you can use less. Panera's new Asiago bagel snacks are just $7.99 each, packed with bold flavors and here for a limited time.
One time we did a jump and the car bottomed out heavier than it should have done. So we scratched our heads, but if we had let the tub of the car hit the ground, but we cushioned that. So we built in this flap arrangement under the car, a hinged steel plates. We run off-road, hydraulic bump stops on them. So the car hits the ground, but it's cushioned when it hits the ground. It's gently. That was the secret to getting that car to jump.
In Chicago, we jumped, I think, 40 or 50 foot. Chris then had in his mind that this guy would jump, okay, right, the best stunt for me in Batmobile was the jumping over the moving car. We built a ramp that we can tow behind the car. We get on the move, practice and practice. Take that on set and do it in a tunnel. I was worried I'd get too much height and hit the ceiling. It's at night as well, so I could barely see the ramp. And they say, oh, there's going to be explosion. But you'll be happy in explosion. Absolutely. I said, but only if you give me the biggest button you have. As I hit the ramp and as I was jumping, I had to wait until it was at the top of the arch, just as I felt it come down and hit that button.
To get fired up at the end of Batman Begins, and Chris Corwell eventually convinced me not to, because we'd all sort of fallen in love with him.
It was almost like another character in the film, but the next time round, Chris was adamant that it was going to go.
We didn't want the life of Batmobile to end there, so we designed this projection pod to save his life, so that Batmobile, whilst dying, would save his life and continue the fight.
Goodbye.
the Batmobile therefore comes to have a certain weight and certain responsibility as far as it relates to the power of Bruce Wayne, the power of wealth, the power of military might, the power that he is able to wield. What would happen if that were used against him?
Graphic storytelling is an art that began with paintings and caves thousands and thousands of years ago. Comic book art has been around in a sense since the hieroglyphics of Egypt. If you look at the conveyances that great heroes have had at their beck and call, the wonderful steeds of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, it's noble. It's the noble steed.
One of the Greek heroes rode Pegasus. Odin, from Norse mythology, had an 8-legged horse. Giving the hero a unique conveyance is one of those things that is in mythology.
When you look at comic books and superheroes, it's still really about the brave warrior and his battle against evil. And it's just told in modern-day dress. It is our modern-day mythology. Batman developed his own great steed, a car called the Batmobile.
And even though the look has varied, the essence of it has remained the same. Your mental image of it is where you came in on the story. But yet, you have a conversation with someone. You're both talking about the Batmobile, and emotionally it's the same thing. Even if the visions in your heads are radically different physical objects.
Today is the first time in history that they've all been together.
All right. Look at those.
Wow. You can't help it when you're a kid growing up on this TV show. That's what you watch the show for, to watch it come ripping out of the back cage. This car is a big reason why I became enthralled with entertainment, the film industry, and wanting to do vehicles in the film industry. Do you mind if I sit in this?
Yeah.
Okay, you're going to sit over there and you're going to say atomic batteries, the power, turbines, the speed. That's the backbone. I mean, that's Commissioner Gordon's hotline. That's awesome.
That is unbelievable.
Oh, come on.
First time it's been running in 10 years. Unbelievable. Thank you.
One of the biggest historical events ever was when all of the Batmobiles came up to Bob's Drive-In.
Everyone's a little kid here today. It's not just little kids, it's everyone.
It really means a lot to see them all here because they built these cars. They're real cars.
I'll probably never see us again, so I made sure to come down here fast. I don't have a favorite. I love every one of them.
Oh, I'm actually visiting down here from Vegas, and I just came on a good weekend, I guess. Seeing the cars in person, that's awesome.
Larger than life. I had no idea they were so huge. They're great. I want one for Christmas.
I'm here just to enjoy the moment. It's history, you know, seeing them all in one place.
It's spectacular up close.
I have a BMW. I'd like to drive the Batmobile out of here, though. Bounty Mega Wing. 4 rolls in 1. What about getting
Quarterbacks ready. Steps up, hands off the wrist for the running back. Stretches, and brings it home.
I drive a 13 or 14-year-old Saturn.
I drive a pickup truck. I've got a 71 Camaro I bought when I was 19. I just got a little mini Cooper.
I drive a Prius. I have a Toyota pickup. But I like a Lamborghini.
I have a Range Rover, a black Range Rover.
I drive a Porsche.
BMW 328.
Porsche 4S, 911 4S.
Honda CR-V.
Boring ass car. Like, go out in the parking lot, there's at least 10 identical ones in any parking lot I park in. I drive a lame ass car.
I have a good number of vehicles, a good number of really cool, fun cars, and I never, people ask me what was your favorite. You couldn't pick. It's like, what's your favorite kid? You can't pick that. And then something came along, and now I know the answer. I saw it on eBay, and I'm like, a Keaton Batmobile, a Tim Burton Batmobile is for sale, and this was actually used in a movie? How is this possible? I can't believe I'm driving a Batmobile. Every kid dreams of that. Every little boy dreams of something like that. I mean, to me, the most important things in life are to take care of your family, give to charity, save for the future, and if you're lucky enough to be able to do all those things, and then you have a little extra cash, when this thing came up for sale, how could I not do this? There's an opportunity of buying the freaking Batmobile. I cannot think of another vehicle on this planet besides this space shuttle that I would rather be behind the wheel of and driving down the street. It doesn't get any better than that.
I think it's very hard to say why the Batmobile resonates the extent it does. Certainly the idea that you could relate this vehicle to family cars, if you have a car as a teenager, learning to drive, you could put yourself in that position. Imagine having this incredibly exotic vehicle. The idea of power in a vehicle like that is extremely primal.
The Batmobile is a dream. It's part of the dream of being something other, something greater than self.
I get letters from people who will tell me how, as a child, they were inspired by watching the show or seeing our movie. Now, the ones that really get to me and impress me are those letters that I get and comments by people that say, I had no father. My father left or he passed away or whatever, and you became my father all these years. And, that just touches your heart.
Batman and the Batmobile symbolize the ability to have power over that which we feel powerless against.
2.5 years ago, I was diagnosed with cancer. It was a pretty aggressive treatment. A lot of radiation and chemo.
I've done that for 25 years. People are very close together, and he went through a tough period where you didn't have a lot left. The powerful thing to go through your life.
You meet extraordinary people. You meet people, you lose them.
He then went on to say how great these people were that helped him through it, got him through it. He's out the other end. He's by all intents and purposes clear of it.
I love to give something back to all those people that got me through that. The idea is to get a Batmobile to Children's Hospital in Vancouver, cancer unit, a positive thing like that to get a smile on their face. That helps in the whole process. Something to look forward to, something to brighten the day. Or worse, I dearly love to do that. ultimately, it can go either way. It's a chance to forget about it and maybe for a day or two. Have a bit of fun with the kids. We can help with that. That's all we're looking for.
The Batmobile is a dream made real. It's not about whether it's a toy, it's not about whether it's a real car. It's about whether it's something you can rumble in the back of your head and have that raw power in your imagination.
One of the guys I work for once said, you've got the coolest job in the world, and you're building Batman's car, that's simply his dream.
The car has changed not only my life, but my family's life. I'm gonna fortunate kid.
There was one day I didn't want to get up and go to work.
You know, it was like a dream come true for its son.
I'm just dreaming I was driving.
I feel privileged that as filmmakers, we're all fans, or we wouldn't be doing it. And then we get to pass that on. I think they're all iconic. It just depends what age you were when you saw it. It's your Batmobile. That was the first one you saw.
For me, as for a lot of people my age, you can't really remember a time before I've always been aware of it.
The Batmobile's become a mythic kind of character in itself.
Batmobile is extraordinarily powerful and exotic, but you can imagine yourself driving.
Subway's got a different $6.99 meal of the day deal for every day of the week. Yes, Tuesdays. Welcome to Bosch.
Eject sequence initiated. Goodbye.
How to store and sort all your photos and videos in seconds. No computer knowledge required. This tiny device can safely back up and store thousands of pictures and videos in a matter of seconds. And it's compatible with all devices. Just plug it in, and it automatically finds and backs up all your photos and videos without any effort. You don't need any computer knowledge to use it, and you won't need to...
Chapter 1. On the Plains in 1844. My father was one of the restless ones who are not content to remain in one place long at a time. Late in the fall of 1838, we immigrated from Ohio to Missouri. Our first halting place was on Green River, but the next year we took a farm in Platte County. He engaged in farming and blacksmithing and had a wide reputation for ingenuity. Anything they needed, made, or mended sought his shop. In 1843, Dr. Whitman came to Missouri. The healthful climate induced my mother to favor moving to Oregon. Immigration was the theme all winter, and we decided to start for Oregon. Late in 1843, Father sold his property and moved near St. Joseph. And in April 1844, we started across the plains. The first encampments were a great pleasure to us children. We were 5 girls and 2 boys, ranging from the girl baby to be born on the way to the oldest boy, hardly old enough to be any help, starting on the plains. We waited several days at the Missouri River. Many friends came that far to see the immigrants start on their long journey, and there was much sadness at the farm, and a sorrowful company crossed Missouri that bright spring morning. The motion of the wagon made us all sick, and it was weeks before we got used to the seasick motion. Rain came down and required us to tie down the wagon covers, and so increased our sickness by confining the air we breathed. Our cattle recrossed in the night and went back to their winter quarters. This caused delay in recovering them and a weary forced march to rejoin the train. This was divided into companies, and we were in that, commanded by William Shaw. Soon after starting, Indians raided our camp one night and drove off a number of cattle. They were pursued, but never recovered. Soon everything went smooth, and our train made steady headway. The weather was fine, and we enjoyed the journey pleasantly. There were several musical instruments among the immigrants, and these sounded clearly on the evening air when camp was made, and merry talk and laughter resounded from almost every campfire. Incidents of travel. We had 1 wagon, 2 steady yoke of old cattle, and several of young and not well-broken ones. Father was no ox driver and had trouble with these, until one day he called on Captain Shaw for assistance. It was finished by the good captain pelting the refractory steers with stones until they were glad to come to terms. Reaching the buffalo country, our father would get someone to drive his team and start on the hunt, for he was enthusiastic in his love of such sport. He not only killed the great bison, but often brought home on his shoulder the timid antelope that had fallen at his unerring aim,
and that are not often shot by ordinary marksmen. Soon after crossing South Platte, the unwieldy oxen ran on a bank and overturned the wagon, greatly injuring our mother. She lay long insensible in the tent put up for the occasion. August 1st, we nooned in a beautiful grove on the north side of the Platte. We had by this time got used to climbing in and out of the wagon when in motion. In performing this feat that afternoon, my dress caught on an axle helve, and I was thrown under the wagon wheel, which passed over and badly crushed my limb before Father could stop the team. He picked me up and saw the extent of the injury when the injured limb hung dangling in the air. The father dying on the plains. In a broken voice, he exclaimed, "My dear child, your leg is broken all to pieces." The news soon spread along the train, and a halt was called. A surgeon was found, and the limb set. Then we pushed on the same night to Laramie, where we arrived soon after dark. This accident confined me to the wagon the remainder of the long journey. After Laramie, we entered the great American desert, which was hard on the teams. Sickness became common. Father and the boys were all sick, and we were dependent for a driver on the Dutch doctor who set my leg. He offered his services and was employed, but though an excellent surgeon, he knew little about driving oxen. Some of them often had to rise from their sick beds to wade streams and get the oxen safely across. One day, 4 buffalo ran between our wagon and the one behind. Though feeble, Father seized his gun and gave chase to them. This imprudent act prostrated him again, and it soon became apparent that his days were numbered. He was fully conscious of the fact, but could not be reconciled to the thought of leaving his large and helpless family in such precarious circumstances. The evening before his death, we crossed Green River and camped on the bank. Looking where I lay helpless, he said, "Poor child, what will become of you?" Captain Shaw found him weeping bitterly. He said his last hour had come, and his heart was filled with anguish for his family. His wife was ill, the children small, and one likely to be a cripple. They had no relatives near, and a long journey lay before them. In piteous tones, begged the captain to take charge of them and see them through. This he stoutly promised. Father was buried the next day on the banks of Green River. His coffin was made of 2 troughs dug out of the body of a tree, but next year emigrants found his bleaching bones as the Indians had disinterred the remains. We hired a young man to drive, as Mother was afraid to trust the doctor. But the kind-hearted German would not leave her and declared his intention to see her safe in the Willamette. At Fort Bridger, the stream was full of fish, and we made nets of wagon sheets to catch them. That evening, the new driver told Mother he would hunt for game if she would let him use the gun. He took it, and we never saw him again. He made for the train in advance, where he had a sweetheart. We found the gun waiting our arrival at Whitman's. Then we got along as best we could, with the doctor's help. Mother planned to get to Whitman's and winter there, but she was rapidly failing under her sorrows. The nights and mornings were very cold, and she took cold from the exposure unavoidably. With camp fever and a sore mouth, she fought bravely against fate for the sake of her children. But she was taken delirious soon after reaching Fort Bridger and was bedfast. Traveling in this condition over a road clouded with dust, she suffered intensely. She talked of her husband, addressing him as though present, beseeching him in piteous tones to relieve her sufferings, until at last she became unconscious. Her babe was cared for by the women of the train. Those kind-hearted women would also come in at night and wash the dust from the mother's face and otherwise make her comfortable. We traveled a rough road the day she died, and she moaned fearfully all the time. At night, one of the women came in as usual, but she made no reply to questions. So she thought her asleep and washed her face, then took her hand and discovered the pulse was nearly gone. She lived but a few moments, and her last words were, "Oh, Henry, if you only knew how we have suffered." The tent was set up, the corpse laid out, and next morning we took the last look at our mother's face. The grave was near the road. The willow brush was laid in the bottom and covered the body. The earth filled in. Then the train moved on. Her name was cut on a headboard, and that was all that could be done. So, in 26 days, we became orphans. 7 children of us, the oldest 14, and the youngest a babe. A few days before her death, finding herself in possession of her faculties and fully aware of the coming end, she had taken an affectionate farewell of her children and charged the doctor to take care of us. She made the same request of Captain Shaw. The baby was taken by a woman in the train, and all were literally adopted by the company. No one there but was ready to do us any possible favor. This was especially true of Captain Shaw and his wife. Their kindness will ever be cherished in grateful remembrance by us all. Our parents could not have been more solicitous or careful. When our flour gave out, they gave us bread as long as they had any, actually dividing their last loaf. To this day, Uncle Billy and Aunt Sally, as we call them, regard us with the affection of parents. Blessings on his hoary head. At Snake River, they lay by to make our wagon into a cart as our team was wearing out. Into this was loaded what was necessary. Some things were sold, and some left out on the plains. The last of September, we arrived at Grand Ronde, where one of my sister's clothes caught fire, and she would have burned to death, only that the German doctor, at the cost of burning his hands, saved her. One night, the captain heard a child crying, and found my little sister had got out of the wagon and was perishing in the freezing air, for the nights were very cold. We had been out of flour and living on meat alone, so a few were sent in advance to get supplies from Dr. Whitman and return to us. Having so light a load, we could travel faster than the other teams, and went on with Captain Shaw and the advance. Through the Blue Mountains, cattle were giving out and left lying on the road. We made but a few miles a day. We were in the country of Dr. Whitman's Indians, as they called themselves. They were returning from buffalo hunting and frequented our camps. They were loud in praise of the missionaries and anxious to assist us. Often they would drive up some beast that had been left behind, as given out, and return it to its owner. One day, when we were making a fire of wet wood, Francis thought to help the matter by holding his powder horn over a small blaze. Of course, the powder horn exploded, and the wonder was he was left alive. He ran to a creek nearby and bathed his hands and face, and came back destitute of whiskers and eyebrows, and his face was blackened beyond recognition. Such were the incidents and dangerous and humorous features of the journey. We reached Umatilla on October 15th and lay by while Captain Shaw went on to Whitman's station to see if the doctor would take care of us, if only until he could become located in the Willamette. We purchased of the Indians the first potatoes we had eaten since we started on our long and sad journey. October 17th, we started for our destination, leaving the baby very sick, with doubts of its recovery. Mrs. Shaw took an affectionate leave of us all and stood looking after us as long as we were in sight. Speaking of it in later years, she said she never saw a more pitiful sight than that cart full of orphans going to find a home among strangers. We reached the station in the forenoon. For weeks this place had been a subject for our talk by day and formed our dreams at night. We expected to see log houses occupied by Indians and such people as we had seen about the forts. Instead, we saw a large white house surrounded with palisades. A short distance from the doctor's dwelling was another large adobe house built by Mr. Gray, but now used by immigrants in the winter and for a granary in the summer. It was situated near the mill pond, and the grist mill was not far from it. Between the two houses were the blacksmith shop and the corral, enclosed with slabs set up end ways. The garden lay between the mill and the house, and a large field was on the opposite side. A good-sized ditch passed in front of the house, connecting with the mill pond, intersecting other ditches all around the farm for the purpose of irrigating the land. We drove up and halted near this ditch. Captain Shaw was in the house conversing with Mrs. Whitman. Glancing through the window, he saw us, and turning to her, said, "Your children have come. We'll go out and see them." He then came out and told the boys to help the girls out and get their bonnets. Alas, it was easy to talk of bonnets, but not to find them. But one or two were finally discovered by the time Mrs. Whitman had come out. Here was a scene for an artist to describe. Foremost stood the little cart with the tired oxen that had been unyoked, lying near it. Sitting in the front end of the cart was John, weeping bitterly. On the opposite side stood Francis, his arms on the wheel and his head resting on his arms, sobbing aloud. On the near side, the little girls were huddled together, bareheaded and barefooted, looking at the boys and then at the house, dreading we knew not what. By the oxen stood the good German doctor with his whip in his hand, regarding the scene with suppressed emotion. Thus Mrs. Whitman found us. She was a large, well-formed woman, fair complexion, with beautiful auburn hair, nose rather large, and large gray eyes. She had on a dark calico dress and a gingham sunbonnet. We thought, as we shyly looked at her, that she was the prettiest woman we had ever seen. She spoke kindly to us as she came up, but like frightened things, we ran behind the cart, peeping shyly around at her. She then addressed the boys, asking why they wept, adding, "Poor boys, no wonder you weep." She then began to arrange things as we threw them out, at the same time conversing with an Indian woman sitting on the ground nearby. A little girl, about 7 years old, soon came and stood regarding us with a timid look. This was little Helen Mar Meek, and though a half-breed, she looked very pretty to us in her green dress and white apron and neat sunbonnet. Having arranged everything in compact form, Mrs. Whitman directed the doctor and the boys where to go, and told Helen to show the little girls the way to the house. Seeing my lameness, she kindly took me by the hand and my little sister by the other hand, and thus led us in. As we reached the steps, Captain Shaw asked if she had any children of her own. Pointing to a grave at the foot of the hill not far off, she said, "All the child I ever had sleeps yonder." She added that it was a great pleasure to her that she could see the grave from the door. The doctor and boys, having deposited the things as directed, went over to the mansion. As we entered the house, we saw a girl about 9 years old washing dishes. Mrs. Whitman spoke cheerfully to her and said, "Well, Marianne, how do you think you will like all these sisters?" Seated in her armchair, she placed the youngest on her lap, and calling us around her, asked our names, about our parents, and the baby, often exclaiming, as we told our artless story, "Poor children." Dr. Whitman came in from the mill and stood at the door, looking as though surprised at the large addition so suddenly made to the family. We were a sight calculated to excite surprise, dirty and sunburned, until we looked more like Indians than white children. Added to this, John had cropped our hair so that it hung in uneven locks, and added to our uncouth appearance. Seeing her husband standing there, Mrs. Whitman said, with a laugh, "Come in, doctor, and see your children." He sat down and tried to take little Louisa in his arms, but she ran screaming to me, much to the discomfiture of the doctor and amusement of his wife. She then related to him what we had told her in reference to the baby, and expressed her fears lest it should die, saying it was the baby she wanted most of all. Our mother had asked that we might not be separated, so Captain Shaw now urged the doctor to take charge of us all. He feared the board might object, as he was sent a missionary to the Indians. The captain argued that a missionary's duty was to do good, and we certainly were objects worthy of missionary charity. He was finally persuaded to keep us all until spring. His wife did not readily consent, but he told her he wanted boys as well as the girls. Finding the boys willing to stay, he made a written agreement with Captain Shaw that he would take charge of her. Before Captain Shaw reached the valley, Dr. Whitman overtook him and told him he was pleased with the children, and he need give himself no further care concerning them. The baby was brought over in a few days. It was very sick, but under Mrs. Whitman's judicious care was soon restored to health. Our faithful friend, the German doctor, left us at last, safe in the motherly care of Mrs. Whitman. Well had he kept his promise to our dying mother. End of section 1. For a week or two, the house at Waialaku was full of company. Having no help, Mrs. Whitman was too much engaged in household affairs to pay any attention to us. Very lonely did that large house seem to me during that time. Being a cripple, I was not able to join the other children in their pastimes, and they were too busy enjoying themselves to attend to me. Seated by the cradle, I plied my needle at simple sewing. I saw my brothers only at mealtime. Mrs. Whitman came occasionally to bring the baby her milk. I thought I could never be happy where everything was so strange, and shed many tears in solitude. I became so timid as to cry if addressed by the doctor or anyone. School commenced soon after our arrival, and most of the children attended. In course of time, the company left the home. Help was hired to do the housework, and Mrs. Whitman, having more time to herself, paid more to us. Gathering us around her in the evening, she amused us with anecdotes, distributing pieces of calico and showing us how to make patchwork and rag dolls, conversing with us in a kind and familiar way. On one of these occasions, she gave each of us a string of beads to wear, with the understanding that anyone who had to be reproved for doing wrong must return the beads to her. We had long been without restraint, so that we had become quite unruly and difficult to manage. They were strict disciplinarians, and held the reins with steady hands. Any deviation from the rules met with instant and severe chastisement. Every effort to merit their approval was rewarded with smiles. While we were held under strict subjection, every effort was made to render us comfortable and happy, and to win our love and confidence. Mrs. Whitman was particularly adapted to raising children, having the art of uniting instruction and pleasure. She was a fine singer. I have never known anyone who excelled her in this respect. She soon commenced teaching us vocal music. Refined and accomplished herself, she exercised over our rude natures that influence that refines and beautifies a home. We soon formed a warm attachment for her and fell into the practice of calling her and Dr. Whitman mother and father, as the other children did, and continued it while they lived. They were careful to have us remember our parents and would speak of them with affection and respect. When necessary to administer punishment, she would set our fault before us and her own responsibility, and show that all was done for our own good, and would ask what we thought our parents would wish her to do. Dr. Whitman's family, before we came, consisted of himself and wife, Perrin P. Whitman, his nephew, who came out with him in 1843 when 14 years old, Mary Ann Bridget, 9 years old, Helen Mar Meek, 7 years old, who had been raised from infancy by Mrs. Whitman, and David M. Cortez, 7 years old. This boy's father was a Spaniard, his mother a Walla Walla Indian. Becoming tired of the infant, she cast it into a hole to perish. His grandmother rescued him and took him to Mrs. Whitman, naked except a small piece of skin tied over his shoulders. We were in the schoolroom from Monday morning until Saturday noon. The afternoon was a holiday. If the weather was pleasant, the preparations for the Sabbath being completed, Mrs. Whitman took us out for a ramble over the hills. In inclement weather, we were provided amusement in the house. The doctor believed in young folks having plenty of exercise. The Sabbath was always strictly observed, yet made so pleasant that we hailed its dawn with delight. Every preparation was made the day before, and perfect stillness pervaded the house Sabbath morning. In the winter season, a Bible class met on Saturday night. All the family attended, and no effort was spared to make it interesting. A subject was given us to prove from the Bible, and Mrs. Whitman saw that each child had a proof to bring in. They were commented on, a chapter was read, each one reading a verse and giving their thoughts on it. These exercises closed by singing some Bible hymn. Sabbath morning, we were reminded of the day, and all kept still. Each sat with a book, and those too small to read were handed pictures. After breakfast, we prepared for Sunday school that met at 11 o'clock, while the doctor held his service with the natives. Each got 7 verses, one being learned every morning during the week. This was an interesting hour spent together, especially when the doctor could spend some moments with us. At 3 p.m. we met for the regular afternoon service, when Dr. Whitman read a sermon. He was not a preacher, but a physician. We had to find the text after the service was over and repeat it to him. The evening was spent in reading, reciting the commandments, etc. One evening in the week, Mrs. Whitman would collect the young around her, holding a prayer meeting with them and conversing on religious subjects. First Monday night in each month, a meeting was held in behalf of the missions, and Monday after New Year's was observed as a fast day. The housework was hired done in winter, so the children could follow their studies without hindrance. Mrs. Whitman and the girls did the work in the summer. Each of us had her allotted task and was expected to promptly do her duty. At 11, we bathed in the river. Dinner was served at 12. When the work was done, we all sat in a large room at our sewing, save one of us who read aloud to the rest. Supper was at 5 o'clock, and after that was over, time until retiring for the night was devoted to recreation. In the spring, the evenings were spent in the garden putting in seeds. Otherwise, we did as we pleased. Sometimes the boys would bring horses for us to ride. At times, we would go with the doctor to visit the lodges where Indians were sick. Mrs. Whitman was always with us in all these occupations, adding to our enjoyment. She was very fond of flowers, and we assisted in taking care of her flower garden each season. Our time flowed on in one uninterrupted stream of pleasure. We were kept constantly gaining knowledge, and from morning until night, our adopted parents labored to promote our happiness. The family was larger in the winter. From 20 to 25, including children, sat around the table at meals. Besides the adopted children, there were others who came to attend the mission school. Summers, the doctor was gone most of the time, so there was only Mrs. Whitman and the children. Mr. Spaulding's daughter attended school with us. She came on horseback, in charge of an Indian woman, 120 miles. The manner of living was simple. In winter, we had beef, and in the summer, mutton and fish. Pork seldom came on the table. Dr. Whitman ignored fine flour, and wheat flour and cornmeal were used unbolted. Tea and coffee came to the table only on rare occasions. This was a matter of economy, as delicacies were not easy to get in the country at that time. There was an abundance of wild fruit to be purchased of the natives. A good garden supplied plenty of vegetables. Cake and pastry only were seen on holidays. Milk, butter, and cheese were in full supply, and thus you have our mode of living at Waialaki. Some may ask how the washing for so large a family was managed. As early as 4 o'clock, all hands were mustered for work in the kitchen. Mrs. Whitman at the head. Tubs and barrels were put in use, and all the implements needed were at hand. The boys, with long aprons tied around them, brought the water and did the pounding, while the women rubbed their clothes. Jokes were current, and all were in good humor. By school time, 9 o'clock, the clothes were on the line. It fell to the lot of myself and brother to get breakfast on wash days. Owing to the location and the evaporation in the spring of alkaline ponds nearby, Waialaki was not healthy. The mill pond was nearby, and we were more or less troubled with chills and fever in warm weather. I was very subject to it, and suffered every summer of my stay there, being often unable to labor. As the eldest daughter, I had supervision of the other girls, and from being confined to the house so much, I became the constant companion of Mrs. Whitman. An attachment near to that of mother and daughter existed between us from this constant association. To me, she told all her plans for the pleasure or improvement of the children, as well as her fears and troubles concerning them. When the doctor was long absent, I sat with her and read or conversed, and was her bedfellow. She said often she could not get along without me. The spring after we arrived, Brother Francis resolved to run away to the lower country with those who had wintered there. His reason was he disliked the strict discipline maintained. The doctor was away, and when Francis started to go, Mrs. Whitman urged him pleasantly to stay. But he went on the run, mounted his horse, and was off before the wagons moved which he was to accompany. She had not succeeded in winning the boy's confidence and affection, and Francis was stubborn. Efforts were made to overtake him and get him to come back, but they were unavailing. He went to the Willamette and remained there. On his return, Dr. Whitman talked with John and found he was willing to remain. He then made a proposal to aid the boys to get a start in cattle and horses, so that they would be acquiring property. This was made known to Francis by a letter, and a horse sent for him. so that in the fall we had the pleasure of again becoming a united family. In the spring of 1845, the Cayuses were embroiled in war with the Snakes. A Cayuse family named Prince was going to the buffalo country to hunt, and on the way camped on a small stream in the Snake region, opposite a camp of Snake Indians. One morning, Prince, with his servant, rode over to see the other camp. His horse stood all day tied at the Snake Lodge. But the mother did not go to learn about him because her daughter said it would be foolish. Toward night, the horse disappeared, and during the night, the Snake camp also disappeared. Going over there, the mother and daughter found the dead bodies of servant and master. War resulted, in which many Cayuses lost their lives, including some of their chiefs. We saw them come home from their war raids and heard and saw them singing war songs, dancing their war dances, and then they would change to a funeral dirge for their dead warriors. After a successful raid, they would spend days celebrating their victory and reciting the prowess of their own warriors. The beating of drums and their war whoops and songs filled the air with savage sounds. The monotonous tones of the Indian flute mellowed the horrors of the dead a little. One Sunday morning in the autumn of 1845, two men arrived at the station. One of them, Andrew Rogers, was a young man of about 25, tall and slender, sandy hair, and sallow look that betokened ill health. He sang hymns and played the violin, so the seceders, to which church he belonged, turned him out. His gentlemanly appearance and intelligence won the admiration of Dr. and Mrs. Whitman. He came to procure room and care for a friend who was ill with consumption. He succeeded in this, and was also engaged to teach school the ensuing winter. Going to Umatilla, he soon returned with his friend, Joseph Finley, who took board with the family of Mr. Osborne, his relative. He had made the journey to Oregon hoping for improved health. For a while, he improved and seemed stronger. Dr. and Mrs. Whitman became much attached to him. He was one day taken worse when at their house, and never left it. They made him comfortable and tended to him as if he were a son or brother. He died very happy, bidding all goodbye and thanking his friends for all their care of him. All gathered round the deathbed, and the scene was very impressive as he gave his last farewell to all around him. About this time, the station had a visit from a band of Delaware Indians under the leadership of Tom Hill, who was very intelligent and could speak English as well as Cayuse. Dr. Whitman made a feast for them and invited the leading Cayuses and others. The indispensable item of an Indian feast was corn mush. A large kettle was suspended over a fire in the yard, and the mush was made by putting in tallow and stirring in meal or flour. When cooked, the kettle was taken indoors and placed on the floor. The doctor was master of ceremonies, and the rest came in order of rank. The doctor and the chiefs dipped their spoons in the big kettle, but common people had dishes served and ate out of them. Some acted as waiters. They had tea, sweetened. We children were looking on, and it amused us to see what a quantity of sugar they used, all that the tea could hold. It was evening, and the family occupied a bench on one side of the big room, which was crowded. It was well lighted with candles, and they ate in silence, except the sipping noise peculiar to Indians eating. Their performances at the trencher were so amusing to us that occasionally Mrs. Whitman had to send us outdoors to have our laugh out. When the feast was over, the room was cleared and put in order for the speech. Tom Hill delivered an address that lasted 2 hours and was quite eloquent. We could understand the Cayuse talk, but the Indians did not know it. We were not allowed to learn it and kept as much as possible away from the Indians, but constantly hearing the language spoken, we could not help but learning the meaning of it, though we could not speak it well. After the massacre, they soon found out that we understood their talk. Mrs. Whitman always treated them politely and kindly, thanking them for every little favor they did her. The next spring, Mr. Rogers was away much of the time at the Spokane mission, conducted by Messrs. Walker and Beals. Dr. Whitman was absent at the sawmill, or breaking up land for the Indians and clodding in the crops. Mrs. Whitman and the girls spent the time at home and found enough to employ them to prevent feeling lonesome. We studied botany with her and rambled over the country in search of flowers and plants. A bad man was named Tamakas, meaning murderer, as he had once killed a man. One day the doctor was at work in his field when this